Today, we're going to cover some of the caving and cave diving disasters that we have covered on this channel. Be sure to subscribe for more videos like this. Lance Taysom is a caver and climber who won an award from the International Technical Rescue Symposium in 2017. Around 15 years prior, he led a group, including his friend and their 2 boys, on a caving trip to Crystal Ice Cave. The group expertly scouted their trip ahead of time, but despite all their planning and expertise, they found themselves trapped in a frozen cave deep below ground. This is the story of how his own son risked everything to find a way to save them all from the frozen grip of Crystal Ice Cave. Before we dive into the video, I want to take a moment to thank all of you who have subscribed to this channel. Our subscriber rate has grown from 8% to 13%, which is truly amazing. If you're new here, simply click the subscribe button, like this video, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. Now let's get into the video. On a snowy morning in May, Lance Taysom, his friend, and their 2 sons, ages 8 and 13, drove around 22 miles northwest of American Falls, Idaho, to the Crystal Ice Cave. Along the way, they passed through a park called the Craters of the Moon, a region named for large, barren mountains that descend onto empty fields covered in the remains of volcanic eruptions like misshapen cinder cones and glassy obsidian. Some regions of the park are covered in blackened rock stretching out as far as the eye can see, creating an alien landscape resembling the surface of the moon. In other sections of the park, small shrubs dot the landscape, and in the distance, craters of red and black rock dig into the earth with walking trails on their rims. Along their borders, the sagebrush starts to dominate the land, and even some tough pioneering trees have wrestled for their spot in the harsh environment of the park. Normally, the ground by the cave was covered in miles of sagebrush and little shrubs. Their dry twigs and rough fibers should have been visible poking up through the snow, but the ground was oddly flat as the cavers approached. All of the shrubs were gone. It made for an eerie sight as they gazed out on the empty field of snow. At 10 a.m., the group began rigging a rope at a hole in the ground. This hole was scheduled to be their exit and the hardest climb of the cave. The group carefully crouched down in the snow and looked down this skylight into the chamber below. With the sun shining through the chasm, they could see the rope to check that it was safely resting on the ground, which took all the guesswork out of rigging the proper length. Taysom had been to the Crystal Ice Cave many times before, so he knew the chamber below was covered in snow that floated down through the skylight. In previous trips, the snow was only around 2 feet deep inside the cave. Snow on the cave floor was normal, and it even had some benefit since the weight of boots easily compressed it, adding a few extra inches of height, which made it easier to start the climb out of the skylight. He used a 200-foot rope and verified that multiple coils were lying flat on the ground so that they had some extra leeway just in case. Outside, on their way to the main entrance to finish preparations, they walked past the remains of lava rock that had turned to rusty orange hues from exposure to the air and sunlight. They planned to enter through a large, collapsed pit with a small hole near one side. The cave had a second entrance, but that region was supposed to be blocked, and it was mostly horizontal in length, so it was less sporty than rappelling down the chasm in the wintry winds. The 3 cavers were well dressed for their outing. Taysom also did mountaineering in the winter, so their gear could handle the cold weather both above and below ground. Their thick gloves were designed to insulate while also providing enough grip to hang on to their ropes. They had a mixture of safety features at their disposal, like harnesses, lights, extra food, water, and all the training in the world. In the barren landscape above the rift, the group had to get creative with their anchors. Once the ropes were secured, they began their descent. The wind was furious, causing the rope to sway as snow blew onto their faces and eyes from above. Taysom and his friend showed the boys how to manage the onslaught of snow and wind. Little did they know, just 11 years before their outing, 19-year-old Evan L. Bates slipped off the edge of the nearby Kings Bowl and fell 100 feet to his death. The icy conditions they experienced could easily cause anyone from this group to meet the same fate, but they descended into the bottom of the 42-foot rift without much issue. Wasting no time, they flicked their lights on and breached the entrance of the cave. The entrance rift and the crystal ice cave itself are both some of the many karst structures that have been formed by the Great Rift located along the 400-mile-long Snake River Plain, which connects to Yellowstone in the east. The sealed horizontal entrance met with a trail carved into the splintered rock by a mining engineer who spent his life developing the cave into an attraction for visitors, blasting through the basalt rock to create a safer, artificial entrance spanning a quarter-mile-long tunnel. That was back in the 1960s, but safety inspectors closed the cave roughly 20 years later. Today, the cave has fallen into disrepair, making it a destination for both cavers and explorers who like to catalog the dilapidated remains of old abandoned buildings, ghastly theme parks, and other urbanized structures that are actively being reclaimed by nature. The route they took into Crystal Ice Cave opened into a passage with ceilings high enough for comfortable walking. After a short distance, the group reached the first abandoned viewing room, where tourists used to safely view glamorous ice structures through glass panes that protected the delicate structures from prying hands. Today, the glass is dark and cracked, the paint along the wooden frames has peeled away, and the structures behind the glass have seemingly vanished, leaving only a black void. Taysom's group passed by a line of rusted anchors along the opposite wall, which may have been the remainders of a safety haul line to quickly rescue injured tourists. Or it may have been used to string up emergency rope lights or lanterns. The group crunched broken glass, which cut through the rubber soles of their shoes, but not enough to pierce all the way through. They continued to watch for any nails, since cuts would expose their skin and blood to the practically sub-zero temperatures of the cave. The route they planned through Crystal Ice Cave lacked any difficult crawls, so they could probably avoid bacteria or debris from infecting a wound. But if a hand or foot got injured, it could be almost impossible to complete the cave's numerous climbs. They had to keep their eyes out for many other hazards you wouldn't expect to find below ground, as they trekked through the haunting interior of a cave that was part natural and part excavation, part beauty and part horror. For decades, glass window panes, metal support structures, and other pieces of infrastructure were left to slowly wither away. Renewal projects have tried to cover up evidence of the cave's commercial past by removing some debris, changing trails and roads, and removing railings to make the cave look more natural, but this work was never finished. All hopes of returning the cave to its natural state have been destroyed, just like the miner's dream that made the cave popular to begin with. The group marveled at Crystal Ice Cave's triangular rooms, which look like they could be artificial, but they were made when segments of the ground were pushed upward from the force of magma, creating a pressure ridge-type cave. The unique shape of these tunnels enabled wind to chill water in the cave, forming the ice structures that attracted so many visitors to this spot. However, as the group stepped through a broken window structure, the cavers found the tragic state of Crystal Ice Cave. What was once one of the cave's largest, most spectacular formations was reduced to a frozen puddle with only a few small ice stalagmites remaining. Chemicals from the mining work, vandals, effects of global warming, and mold all worked against the delicate balance of the cave. The mold or fungi that infected the cave also burrowed into rock to form microscopic cave-like structures, consuming it and weakening the structure of the cave. Multiple breakdowns have happened over the years, spurred by the loss of supporting ice and the destructive power of the fungal infestation present within the cave's cramped quarters. Any step could be their last if a cliff were to break before they attached their belay, or if a cave-in crushed or trapped them. Near the desolate spot where tall ice floes once stood, a few larger ice mounds remained below the massive ceiling. The kids had the primal urge to break the icicles off the walls and stomp on the icy spikes on the ground, but the adults reminded them to respect the cave so future generations could enjoy it too. Carefully stepping around the corner, they found another passage tucked away amidst more rubble that sat precariously close to another ledge. They had reached the second climb of Crystal Ice Cave. This time, for the larger 50-foot drop, they rigged a different knot and rappelled into the cave's most stunning descent. Along the wall, ice and rock mixed together to form layers with large, rounded ice rungs and brown, dusty stone. On the ledge up top, water from the ceiling formed a thin layer of black ice that looked nearly invisible in their torchlight, so they had to anchor their rope further back to avoid crashing to the ground below. The icy wall was difficult to manage for some of them. They hadn't brought ice climbing shoes, so they experienced some slips as they tried to create friction against the smooth surface to control their descent. Still, despite the dangers, they conquered this section and found themselves at the bottom of a large rift covered in boulders that had broken off of the walls and ceiling. Taysom and the others used a pull-down rig for this rope. That way, they could take the rope with them once they finished the second climb. Once they completed the cave, they could retrace their steps on the surface to grab the other two ropes. They only had a short distance left to go, so they pulled the rope through the loops up above and moved across the breakdown to the entrance of the 150-foot-tall skylight room, their designated exit. Normally, some faint glows can be seen through the hole past the breakdown as sunlight from the sinkhole beyond filters through the cave. It would be a welcome sight compared to the suffocating darkness of the cave. Taysom and his friend were looking forward to seeing their boy's reactions to the light. But as they got closer, they started to get concerned. This time, as they hiked up the mound of rocks and dirt at the end of the breakdown room, no faintly glowing light was there to beckon their arrival. Earlier, when they rigged the drop, they could see the bottom of the cave, so they knew the skylight should be visible. Why was there only darkness ahead? The skylight was near a hill at the end of the breakdown room, a dense mound that had been formed by sediment drifting into the cave, compacted by water and even more dirt, and hardened into a cement-like formation. As Taysom and his group reached the hill, they were shocked to find that the passage was blocked, filled with almost 20 feet of snow that had compacted to form a thick, impenetrable wall. The group carefully examined the blockage and found footprints in the snow that led up the mound and seemed to disappear under the ceiling. Taysom grabbed a sharp rock and an ice screw and hammered away at the snow plume. Slowly, he formed a small foothold to create a safe pathway up the hill where it met the ceiling. They all hoped that there was a small crack near the top that they could crawl or dig their way through to reach the skylight and exit the cave, but no luck. Something must have changed in the cave since the last time someone was here. There was only supposed to be a few feet of snow in the cave, and it shouldn't even reach this far down. They suppressed creeping sensations of dread as they searched around the room for any signs that could help them through this barrier. They already knew they were trapped, but the dangers hadn't sunk in yet. They couldn't backtrack since they'd already pulled the rope through the second pitch. The large, rounded ice shelves of the pitch would be impossible to climb without ropes. Even if they had ice climbing equipment like picks and spiked shoes that could grip the ice, they would need to perform bouldering maneuvers that not even pros would attempt without a belay, dangling off the ledges with no footholds as they tried to climb over them. The team made fast work of the cave, so they still had hours left before their time limit was up. At that point, relatives back home would report them overdue. A rescue would ensue, and it would be easy for rescuers to reach them since the entry rope was already rigged and they were on the main path. All they needed was a rope to be lowered down the second pitch. They had plenty of food and water, but the temperatures in the cave were incredibly cold. The men could handle the cold just fine, but the boys would be at risk. It was up to them to get out of the cave or risk dying slow, painful deaths in the frigid cold. If no rescue came, or if conditions worsened inside, the men would undoubtedly give their sons extra warmth, and the boys would have to sit idly by as their parents wilted away, curled up and frozen solid. After brushing away part of the snow from the wall, they were excited to find a 5-inch space that had formed between the hard-packed snow and the wall. The gap seemed to go all the way through to the skylight room. How had the gap formed? The boys didn't trust it. It seemed impossible at first, since temperatures were cold enough to prevent the snow from melting, but the faint sunlight and wind through the skylight could have made the snow turn directly into gas without melting in a process called sublimation. Luckily for them, this crack next to the wall bypassed the dense mound of rocks which should have been in the center of the snow wall. The group felt they had only one choice. They all grabbed what they could and worked to enlarge the space. Using primitive rocks and anything they could find in their gear packs, they chipped away at the dense mound of snow and ice. When the passage was just large enough for him, 8-year-old Jesse Taysom volunteered to crawl through the gap. Crawling through this crack would be incredibly risky. If any pieces of ice or rock broke off and tumbled downhill toward the crack, they could crush him, breaking bones, rendering him unconscious, or killing him instantly. The snow had hardened, but if there was any lighter snow beyond their vision, it could also quickly rush into the space, sealing the passage shut and burying him alive while his father looked on helplessly. If a nightmare scenario happened, even trying to dig Jesse out could cause more catastrophe, as the mold-worn cave walls themselves could crumble with all the impact of digging and thrashing into the snow and rubble, crushing or sealing them all inside the cave. In spite of all the dangers, it was up to Jesse to save them. They were all tense as Jesse began his crawl through the tightly packed snow. Wedged against the freezing rock, he felt the cold compress his warm clothing, chilling him to his core. The volcanic metal along the wall threatened to scrape his skin as he contorted through the difficult space. As he wormed his way forward, chunks of icy snow and powdered shavings fell in front of him. He scooped the pieces up and pushed them down to his torso until he could kick the rubble backward to continue crawling. Miraculously, after around 3 feet of crawling in tightly packed snow, the space enlarged to nearly 2 feet in width. Jesse now had enough space to comfortably traverse the rest of the gap to see where it went. He was within earshot still, so he shouted back his discovery. The rest of the team was excited to hear the development, though any loud talking could cause the whole mound to collapse in an underground avalanche. After another 20 feet of crawling, Jesse could see sunlight in the room beyond. They were almost home free. But what was supposed to happen when he reached the other side? Would 8-year-old Jesse have to climb up the 150-foot exit rope by himself? And even if he could, what would they do then? Would he have to traverse the barren wilderness of craters of the moon alone in the blistering wind just to get to civilization and call for help? Would he have to backtrack through the crawl again to grab the rope, complete the first half of the cave, and then rig the second climb by himself? He didn't have time to consider all the possibilities as his easy crawling came to an end. The passage ahead narrowed once more. To get through, he had to dig through the snow all by himself, shoveling it back into and filling up the wider crack. He had limited tools and almost no space to work with. To make matters worse, he didn't have the strength of an adult caver, so each strike with his tools, each grasp with his hands barely made a dent in the wall ahead. As he pushed through, Jesse found himself once again trapped in an icebox. The cold snow made each movement difficult, and the way backward was now layered with ice chunks and shavings. Slowly, after using most of his energy, he persevered and exited the crack. Once on the other side, he found the rope intact at the base of the skylight. The path through the sinkhole was still able to be climbed. Proving it was possible to traverse this gap, Jesse began digging through the tunnel in the opposite direction, grabbing the rubble from his first trip and pushing it out into the skylight room. Eventually, he returned to the group and informed them that they could make it through this narrow crack. With their call-out time fast approaching, the rest of the team worked to enlarge the crack, hammering away at the snow and ice with stones and whatever metal they had on hand in their supply kits. After they widened the first narrow section, they took turns digging through the next layer on their sides, forming a chain between the wall and the mound. After what felt like an eternity in Crystal Ice Cave, the group worked together to widen the last passage enough to enter the skylight room. All thanks to Jesse's scouting effort. It turns out, a wildfire had ravaged the area a year prior to their adventure, destroying all of the sagebrush that normally covered the ground. Without the protection of the shrubs, the wind had no barriers to slow it down. Wind speed increased across the field, blowing snow from the ground into the skylight toward the breakdown chamber below. As layers of snow continued to enter the cave, more and more snow flowed into the mouth of the skylight room. Increased wind chill made the effective temperature lower, which caused the snow to solidify on the cave floor. When Taysom and the other cavers looked down the skylight earlier, they couldn't tell the difference between the normal 2-foot snow coverage they had expected and the massive 10 or so feet of snow that actually blanketed the ground. As they all entered the room, they saw another passage beyond that easily floods. This time, it was covered in ice. Using the last energy they had, Taysom, Jesse, and the others made it out of Crystal Ice Cave, rattled but unharmed. They later learned that another group of cavers experienced the same trap just a few weeks before. Luckily, they had a whistle, and they left one caver above ground. The above-ground member heard the whistle and quickly got them to safety. Ever since those close calls back in the early 2000s, cavers have been advised to check the skylight entrance before removing any ropes from the first or second pitch, or else risk becoming trapped below ground in the freezing snow and ice. "31-year-old Christopher Zitzowitz and his friend Caleb Ritchie went to Gifford Pinchot National Forest to find new caves. The pair left their truck by the roadside and walked on foot into the wilderness, with Washington's Mount St. Helens in the distance. Then, an abnormally dangerous storm brought record-breaking rainfall and unseasonal snowstorms. The pair got separated on October 12th. 3 other hikers were caught in the storm. Rescue teams searched from the air, along the ground, and into the caves to find them. Some would be saved, but Christopher was never seen again. This is the tragedy of the Big Lava Bed Caves. The fall weather attracts travelers from far and wide to the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. It's the perfect time for hikers and cavers to visit, since the pesky bugs are starting to die off, and photographers come to see the fall leaves on vine maples and other unique foliage. This park is home to one of the most notorious volcanoes in history, Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens is an active volcano built on layers of lava stretching to an elevation 8,363 feet high. On May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted, sending a cloud of ash 80,000 feet into the sky, which later fell across 11 different states. This catastrophe was the deadliest and costliest volcanic eruption in U.S. history. It destroyed 47 bridges, 200 homes, 185 miles of roadways, and killed 57 people. During the devastation, a 5.1 magnitude earthquake shook the ground, forming a landslide that left a 1-mile-wide crater below where the peak once stood. Scientists predict future eruptions will be even worse. Eruptions from Mount St. Helens created a twisting network of lava tubes below ground as molten lava cooled on the surface, allowing magma within to flow through. Once the magma flow ceased, the hollow tubes were left barren below ground. In addition to lava tube caves, Gifford Pinchot also has a huge amount of caves formed from erosion and fault shifting as well. As of 2018, the U.S. Forest Service has found 600 caves in the area, though there could be many more yet to be discovered. There are so many caves that scientists haven't been able to uncover them all yet. And since eruptions create new layers of ground, there could be miles of old caves buried deeper out of sight. Features like these make Gifford Pinchot Forest a caver's dream. Few places in the world have such easy access to unexplored caves. Many cavers have traveled to the forest to make their mark on history and discover a new cave or new unexplored passages. However, the forest's vast collection of caves poses a significant problem for rescuers. Cavers could easily get lost on the surface and mistake one entrance for another. Rescuers could waste precious time exploring the wrong cave, or rescuers might not even be able to find the right cave at all. Then, once rescuers begin crawling and climbing their way through the muddied tunnels below ground, they could easily miss new, unexplored, or unmapped passages which could form suddenly and without warning from cave-ins or other natural phenomena. Like many adventurers in the 2010s, Christopher had no memory of the devastation wrought by Mount St. Helens. Like many, he was drawn to the area for its natural beauty and the allure of caving. Christopher and Caleb took their first trip to the forest in search of a cave, to test their might and explore where no human has seen before. The pair went searching on the southern edge of the Gifford Pinchot National Forest in a region called the Big Lava Bed. The sky was dark and gloomy that day. The distant rumbling of thunder hushed the sounds of wildlife as birds and squirrels hurried for shelter. Instead of fleeing from the dreary sky, Christopher and Caleb drove into the storm. Christopher brought a buddy with him, which is proper caving protocol. The two parked their truck by the side of an outback road. Rain started to fall, but it was light for now. They were used to the outdoors, and a little water didn't scare them. They unflinchingly began hiking toward the Big Lava Bed in search of the namesake cave of the area, the Big Lava Bed Cave. The Big Lava Bed is a flat region of land where a smaller lava spout covered the ground with lava thousands of years ago. The dense, metallic rock left little soil for trees to grow, leaving a barren land with grass and lichens sprawling across the 8-mile-long perimeter of the feature. Caving in this area may be exciting, but it's also extremely dangerous for new cavers since there are few available resources for adventurers. There are virtually no maps of the interior of the caves available to the public, and there are no above-ground maps showing their location. That means cavers must pay fees to local caving clubs for access to their maps and pray that the maps are up to date. The Oregon Grotto branch of the National Speleological Society said they would be listing 200 caves on their website, but so far, the links to all of their maps are currently broken. Hikers new to caving might not even know about the Grotto clubs or the NSS, so they're out of luck if they want to explore caves near Mount St. Helens. The Big Lava Bed is also far off the beaten path. There are no roads that reach this remote spot of wilderness, so cavers, hikers, and rescuers alike all have to travel a good distance on foot just to begin their exploration. The pair were dressed light, ready for a hike, but ill-equipped to handle the dangerous atmosphere below ground. The weather also began to turn. They noticed it was getting colder, and their windbreakers wouldn't be enough to keep them warm. But it wasn't quite winter yet, so they carried on. Soon, the rain turned into a deluge. The rain blanketed the sky. The rain lowered their visibility. It was so hard to see that they began to get disoriented, but they wanted to find the cave, so they decided to split up to search for the Big Lava Bed Cave. That way, they could cover more ground. The storm raged on, and eventually the rain turned to snow. But the volume didn't change. A full-fledged blizzard swept through the forest, and Christopher and Caleb were out of sight. They each checked their cell phones, but there was no reception. They were too far away from the cell towers, and the storm was interfering with what little signal could reach this far. With no way to communicate, Christopher kept searching for the cave. Meanwhile, Caleb Ritchie turned around to search for Christopher. He tried his best, but the storm was too dense. He searched for around 2 hours before returning to the road where they parked the truck. As he opened the truck door, he hoped Christopher would be waiting in the other seat, but the truck was empty. Caleb was uneasy, but the truck would be the logical place to meet, so Caleb waited. Eventually, Christopher looked at his compass to reorient himself. As the snow continued to fall, he knew he had to abandon his mission, find Caleb, and get to safety. But his compass was malfunctioning. The device hadn't suffered any physical damage, but the needle was spinning. Cavers will frequently use compasses to guide them underground, and Christopher's compass should have been doubly useful since the big lava bed has little to no features, just vast, empty plains. Christopher was getting frustrated. Why wasn't his compass working? Unfortunately, he didn't know that the big lava bed and its caves have many unique death traps waiting to ensnare unsuspecting travelers. Normal rock layers found in caves or on Earth's surface aren't magnetic, even though they may contain magnetic minerals. That's because these magnetic minerals are dispersed evenly throughout the rock, so their fields either interfere with one another or they end up having little total charge. But the heat of the lava can create more magnetic minerals as the rocks meld and recombine to form different compounds. These magnetic minerals are free to move through the lava, so they end up attracting each other and combine to create much stronger magnetic fields, which can interfere with the Earth's magnetic North Pole. Christopher was walking on a giant magnet. In desperation, he looked to the sky. Finding a cave on the barren ground was hard without landmarks, but he could figure out his relative position by looking at Mount St. Helens and the surrounding coniferous forest. These landmarks are visible in the distance under normal circumstances, but in the storm, these few defining features were hidden. Christopher looked at his compass again. This time, it stayed in one direction. He looked ahead and walked forward into the unknown. Meanwhile, above ground, further past the big lava bend, 3 hikers were also caught in the strange storm. Matt Margiotta and Kyla Arnold were undertaking the monumental journey along the Pacific Crest Trail. The Pacific Crest Trail is a 2,500-mile-long trail that reaches all the way from Mexico to Canada. They began their trip in February and had been hiking for 8 months. Like Christopher, they thought a little rain wouldn't stop them. Margiotta and Arnold kept online hiking journals that detailed their progress and their experience along the massive trail. Kyla's last few journal entries reminisced about how she and Matt had been living together for 3 months in Arizona. She wrote how the pair hiked together and how he brought her joy. However, shortly before the monstrous storm engulfed them all, her writing took a dark turn. Kyla said her happiness was, quote, followed by a dark, lonely shadow of fear that she never seems to escape. She continued with more ominous lines like, quote, must I bear the sins of us all? And her last journal entry ends with a bit of optimism, saying, quote, I think tomorrow I'll bike to work, bright and early. Her sunny outlook would quickly turn. Matt and Kyla had just escaped a life-or-death situation only a few days prior to reaching the forest above Big Lava Bed Cave. An earlier storm swept through the southern part of Washington, trapping them in their tarp. Arnold wrote how the pair were almost out of food. Her and Margiotta had to sit close under their tarp, combining their body heat for just a chance at survival. They escaped that hell and made it to the small town of Trout Lake. There, they met a woman who was also hiking the whole 2,500-mile distance of the Pacific Crest Trail. Like them, Alejandra Wilson also kept a journal of her journey online. Like Christopher and Caleb, these 3 also saw the coming storm on the horizon. The locals of the small town told the hikers they couldn't make it. Kyla was terrified after her recent brush with death, But she felt she and Matt had traveled too far to give up on their mission now. Wilson wished them good luck and departed a few days before them. Wilson's last journal update told how she nicknamed them Make Do and Coconut, and how the three talked about their adventures. 4 days later, and Wilson was soaked from the same storm battering Christopher and Caleb. Since she left before the other hikers, she got stranded before them. Wilson found herself stuck at her campsite for 7 days as the storm relentlessly hammered the volcanic forest. On that fateful day, a sleep-deprived Wilson awoke to find the rain turned to ice. The ice was layered so thick she couldn't open her tent. Overnight, 6 inches of snow fell, and there was no end in sight. Like Christopher, she remembered a road nearby. And even though she had no idea where it led, she thought it would be her only chance to survive. However, once she packed up her things to begin hiking, she realized the trail leading to the road was gone, covered in snow. The rest of her journal shows her panic as she faced what could have been her death. She wrote the word help in the snow. Her hands weren't moving right. She couldn't grip the zipper on her tarp. And she lost all hope. Alejandra Wilson had been reported missing after she missed her scheduled check-in with her family. Wilson was missing in a different part of the county, but Christopher, Matt, and Kyla were relatively close by. Just hours before Caleb reported that Christopher Zitzevitz was missing, Matt and Kyla miraculously got just enough cell reception to call for help. Rescuers were dispatched on the ground to save Matt and Kyla. They had obtained the hikers' exact GPS coordinates, so they made a mad dash directly to them. A team of 5 rescuers went along the trail and got less than a mile away from Matt and Kyla, but the snowfall and the darkness of nightfall forced them to turn around. 18 rescuers arrived at the big lava bed to search for Christopher. They requested a helicopter, but they were getting flack from authorities. Normally, tons of people volunteer to save people trapped in caves or trapped along trails. Why were so few people sent to save Christopher and the others? Why were requests for aerial support denied? Well, it turns out that they were all somehow even more unlucky. This whole rescue operation took place during a U.S. government shutdown caused by gridlocked political debate. That meant typical Forest Services and search and rescue teams weren't available. Of course, rescuers were contacted, but the centralized command was broken. Rescuers had to be called one at a time. It was slow and disorganized. Some paid rescuers would have volunteered their services for free since the government wasn't paying their salaries during the shutdown, but some were never even contacted. The 3 stranded hikers were decently prepared. They needed a lot more gear for their intense journey up the U.S. They had food, stoves, multiple layers of clothes, insulated jackets, cold weather pants, sleeping bags, gloves, and ski masks. But Christopher only brought hiking gear and no real caving equipment despite his plan to explore Big Lava Bed Cave. He had a helmet, but it was a bike helmet designed to reduce air resistance with breathable holes, which wouldn't give proper protection underground. In caves, even a small pebble could cut open his exposed scalp, and a falling stalactite could be deadly. That helmet wouldn't save him. Even though the odds were stacked against Christopher, rescuers had to turn their attention to Matt and Kyla since they knew exactly where to find them. The rescue effort was significant for the 2 hikers, but since Christopher was a caver, his situation was far more complicated, and specialized cave rescuers were needed. As the team assigned to save Matt and Kyla backtracked to save themselves, they also got stuck. That was the last straw. The search had to be called off, which halted the additional teams who had just begun looking for Christopher. A helicopter was eventually dispatched, but it also had to turn around because of the storm. Rescuers couldn't search for anyone for another day, which was hell for the 4 missing people, but the day of waiting allowed rescuers from all over the country time to gather and plan their search. By the time the storm let up, Roughly 3 feet of snow had fallen over the desolate big lava bed. A helicopter finally came to extract the rescuers. Then, the chopper also located Matt and Kyla, freezing from their frozen hell. They required immediate medical assistance to stave off frostbite, and they were severely dehydrated. Even though they were surrounded by frozen water, they couldn't open their tent to drink it, or the precious heat they trapped inside would vanish. Rescuers then turned their attention towards Christopher and Alejandra. The Skamania County Sheriff's Office led the search and rescue operation, and now that the storm had passed, they got aid from 2 Coast Guard helicopters to search from the skies. Ground teams fanned out along the snow-covered forest, calling his name and searching for any sign of him. Other vehicles, like snowmobiles and off-road capable trucks, aided the ground search, providing light and storage for the rescuers on foot. If they found Christopher, the vehicles could give him much-needed shelter to warm up. 2 canine units were also brought to the scene to search for him. 18 people were there on Wednesday, 4 days after he first went missing, but later, over 100 people gathered to search for Christopher. Caleb told them he could be inside a cave, but rescuers were hesitant to delve below ground. Some lava tubes form with weak ceilings, and they end up collapsing under their own weight, forming deep ruts in the ground instead of tunnels. Christopher might have taken shelter in one of these unstable lava tubes. The cold temperatures from the storm might have weakened the rock, and the added weight of the snow above could have cracked the ceilings, causing a cave-in, burying him under tons of rubble. To avoid that risk, they wanted to look for any visible signs of trouble on the surface first. But as another day ticked by, rescuers had to turn their attention below ground. The big lava bed cave, the one Christopher was supposedly searching for, was once part of a larger lava tube that formed at ground level before part of it collapsed. However, some of the lava tube descends further down, and through the rubble of the collapsed tunnel, another entrance beckons below a cracked, overhanging rock formation. At 645 feet in length, Big Lava Bed's cave is a mixture of lava tubes and cave passages made by erosion. If Christopher found the cave, he might have taken shelter inside. The rescue team had to hike around a 40-foot-tall lava ridge to reach the entrance. Once on the other side, they came to what remained of a lava channel that descended into a large hole in the ground. Like many caves in the area, parts of the roof had collapsed, lining the entryway with boulders. The large open area extends 115 feet before becoming a lava tube inhabited by bats. Deeper on, the lava tube turned into a vertical drop, followed by a large ramp with collapsed passages extending into the room. With a mixture of vertical and horizontal passages, Big Lava Bed's cave could easily flood after so much rainfall. The cave was mapped once before, but the survey team found additional passages that required digging to pass through. A new breakdown could have allowed Christopher to pass through into unknown territory, where maps would fail to aid the rescuers. With no sign of Christopher in Big Lava Bed Cave, rescuers ducked into other caves nearby, like the 455-foot-long chambermaid cave with its knotted passages connecting to 4 large sinkholes that required ropes to traverse. And at the bottom, each of the holes have more passageways to explore. Christopher could have easily slipped and fell into the abyss. Just beyond the junction that connects all the main passages, Chambermaid Cave has a tight squeeze followed by a steep decline that ends in a small hole too small for people to go down. If Christopher found himself there, he could have been stuck, unable to climb out, weak, dehydrated, and too cold to move. If the passage broke apart, he could have fallen down the slippery ramp, tumbling 120 feet along a tube that continues into a slide into the darkness. Rescuers even poke their heads into small caves, like the Berry Cave, which is only 45 feet long, and the Backed Up Cave, which is only 85 feet long. These smaller caves would be easy to check, but some of the caves would be challenging and time-consuming. The extreme conditions and lack of government funding meant that the cave rescuers were worn thin. Many of the caves were only checked with cursory glances into their various entryways. The rescuers' shouts and their lights wouldn't travel very far into the cave. If Christopher was still alive when they got to whatever cave he was in, he would have no way of knowing. Outside of limited human resources, there were other concerns for finding Christopher in a cave. Rescue cavers struggled to locate the exact locations of the caves under so much snow. If Christopher had taken shelter below ground, the packed snow would have sealed the exit to his cave completely shut. If the freezing temperatures didn't get him, the sealed room would fill with carbon dioxide and suffocate him. Maybe he thought he could start a fire inside to keep warm, but that would have made him run out of air even faster. Some of the caves would have likely been flooded already, trapping him on both sides as the snow covered the exit. The rescue team had to be careful around caves because some spelunkers have experienced strange pitfalls in the ground. Some have reported walking when suddenly the ground gave out from under them. A hole barely big enough for a foot to fall through opened in the ground. Below, the sound of a boulder breaking loose from inside the cave crashed down a dark shaft. It's possible spontaneous sinkholes like these grabbed Christopher and dragged him to his doom. Maybe the snow covered a sinkhole just enough for Christopher to think it was solid ground. The nearby Wolf's Pit is so deep, it requires a rope to enter. So if he fell in there, he'd either die from the impact, or the snow would bury him alive as it kept piling up. There are long crevices in the area. Maybe he stepped too close to a ledge and it shattered, sending him plummeting into the darkness. Suddenly, the rescue team felt a surge of adrenaline. One of the dogs found Christopher's tracks. His footprints followed alongside a small stream. Following the flow of water is a classic way to find caves. Resurgences can easily mark an exit, or streams could dip below ground into the entrance of a cave. However, the storm changed Christopher's plans, or maybe his compass led him astray. The dog led rescuers along the river until his footsteps abruptly turned. They kept going along that direction, and then eventually looped. Christopher was walking in circles. The rescuers were confused. Then they found he had doubled back again and again, walking back and forth, making no progress as the snowstorm got worse and his chances of finding his way back got slimmer and slimmer. Eventually, the group searching for Wilson was called off. She had escaped the frozen wasteland and made it to the road where a motorcyclist saw her, and only later realized who she was. Once he informed the rescue team, they found her about 20 miles away from where Matt and Kyla were saved. The Wilson team realized they had been too far north. Just like them, it's possible the group looking for Christopher was completely wrong about his whereabouts. They knew he was looking for Big Lava Bed Cave, but Christopher could have found a completely different cave instead. Christopher could have made it into a lava tube cave, but he could have died before rescuers even arrived. In many caves, a stumble and a shortfall could hurt. Cavers could sprain their wrist or bruise some bones, but it's the big falls they have to worry about. In lava caves, though, a shortfall could be deadly. The hardening lava forms metallic spikes and sharp edges that can easily cause deep gashes in a victim's flesh. Simply bumping your head could split your skin open into a mortal wound. And without the proper first aid, someone trapped in a cave like Christopher could easily bleed out. As the days passed by, the rescuers left, and only search parties remained until eventually even the search was called off. Christopher's sister, Laura, and a group of 3 others, including Richie, kept searching. They drove, honking their car horns, and brought a megaphone so that their voices would carry. They divided up the landscape and used maps to create checkpoints so that they could cover the area more effectively. Since no one knew exactly which cave Christopher could be in, cave rescue teams didn't continue to aid the grieving family. It turned out, Big Lava Bed Cave was right by the road Christopher and Caleb had traveled on. They had been searching in the wrong place the whole time. Time moved on. The National Parks Division, in charge of the area, moved on to different concerns. Law enforcement turned their attention to newer cases. Forest Services removed every cave from all available maps of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest to stop people from entering them. However, true cavers won't be deterred. They'll find a way, and it'll only make it harder for rescuers to find them if updated maps aren't available. Some have claimed that the National Park Service withholds information about people who vanished in their parks out of fear that knowledge of their absence would deter guests. Some investigations claim that nearly 2,000 people go missing in the national parks each year, and while roughly 80% are eventually found, that leaves a shocking number of people who have disappeared completely in the years since Christopher vanished. Matt and Kyla moved on with their lives, and Wilson started a trail comic dubbed Rock On, Rocket Llama. While the journals of most of the people involved are still accessible, Christopher's was deleted. Christopher Zitzowitz was last seen wearing tan pants, a black raincoat, and a black backpack. He also had brown and tan hiking boots and a high-visibility orange bracelet made from parachute cord, similar to what cavers might use for rope. Somewhere below ground in the state of Washington, that small bit of orange rope likely marks his grave. It was November of 1999. People were abuzz about the new year, Y2K. It was not just a new year, but a new millennia. It was also the perfect time of year for cavers and outdoor enthusiasts to head south, where they could enjoy their hobbies in temperate climates without prohibitively cool weather back home. That was the background that brought professional diving instructors Vincent Scaff of Nashville, Tennessee, and Daniel Patterson from Atlanta, Georgia, to one of the world's most famous cave diving spots, 40 Fathom Grotto. However, in spite of their training and their planning, the pair's trip turned into tragedy in the cave known as Florida's Bottomless Pit. The pair met up in one of the nearby towns close to the grotto, once known as Zuber Sink. Once they were in the area, they prepared for their dive, which was scheduled on a Saturday. Both Daniel and Vincent had been to 40 Fathom before. After all, it was practically the birthplace of technical diving. Using the knowledge and first-hand experiences they gained from this massive flooded sinkhole, they instructed and even saved countless cave divers and regular scuba divers over the years. The scenery of their destination formed a different picture of Florida compared to the stereotypical view of Miami beaches. There, in the northern central part of the state, the land was filled with rolling sand hills that met with pine flatwoods and upland hardwood forests, streaked with wetland swamps, bustling with gruff toads calling from the surface of the murky water. With water temperatures around 68 degrees and no currents, the men didn't feel the need to over-prepare. They could use thick wetsuits instead of the more cumbersome dry suits, and they didn't need to plan intricate routes since the cave fans out into mostly open waters below the surface. Going near the edges of the cave would put cavers below a rocky ceiling that has nearly constant curvature all the way around. If divers ever got lost, they could theoretically follow the ceiling to safety. However, deeper sections are more complicated, and the sheer size of the cave makes it easy to get turned around if divers lose their way. Back in the 90s, the area looked similar to how it looks today, only a little more rough around the edges. Today, the cave divers would have gone past the gate to find a large dock complete with a partial ceiling, benches, trash cans, gear stations, and ladders, making it the perfect spot for divers. The dock floats like a barge above the waters that glow an iridescent green when lit by lamps at nighttime. The pair had breakfast and suited up, a process that took even longer than normal for this adventure. They were heavily loaded with gear because they were undertaking what's known as technical diving. In recreational scuba, people only wear one tank, and they can opt out from using other fancy equipment. Technical diving takes people to significantly deeper waters, and 40-fathom grotto pushes cavers to the limits of even technical diving with its max depth of 240 feet, when the hard limit on technical diving is 300 feet. To accomplish their goal of reaching the bottom of Zubersink, they had to bring 2 cylinders of air with proper attachments, and 1 more can of air that they would carry on their side. These canisters could each contain different mixtures of air, so they would have to plan their mixtures before the dive and properly utilize them during the descent. They likely also brought a spare mouthpiece, a reel of guiding line each, something to write on underwater to assist with communication, at least 1 knife or shears, and their fins, masks, and other basics. Other cavers and divers were there on the dock, waiting for their turn, taking part in lessons, or simply chatting with friends as the holidays quickly approached. Once they were fully suited, they stepped off the dock and into the huge pool of water below. They followed hefty guiding lines down to a few training platforms below the water. Soon, the sun above looked small and distorted as they became fully immersed in another world. If they swam in the center of the water, they could hardly tell it was a cave structure. They found a number of strange objects you wouldn't expect to see in the bottom of a natural spring cave. Boats, cars, a 2-seater submarine, and even an airplane fuselage sat rusting beneath the tranquil waters to entertain divers, creating a sense of wonder and exploration that was like any experience the pair had ever encountered in any other spot. However, not all of these attractions were placed here intentionally. Some cars sunk to the bottom after drivers accidentally ran off the road and plunged into the water. Others were disposed of by illicit thieves running chop-chop services, selling stolen car parts and dumping the metal carcasses in the former privacy of the grotto. The pair looked on the wreckage fondly, remembering how they learned the ropes and became inspiring figures in their respected communities. Beyond entertainment or odd circumstance, some of these sunken objects served as instructional tools to teach cave divers techniques for exploring wreckage. They felt in good company, even when they were separated from the parties above. 40 Fathom is an inland spring cave located on private property owned by legendary diver Hal Watts. At nearly 88 years old today, Watts helped shape the world of scuba diving. He even created the Professional Scuba Instructors Association International, or PSAI, back in 1962. 5 years later, Hal, aka Mr. Scuba, set a world record for the deepest air dive at 390 feet, and he later went 415 feet down to get the deep air cave diving world record, descending into the depths using regular air jammed into canisters, a feat that was later broken by his daughter, Scarlett. Scaff and Peterson weren't going to come close to those depths, but even at lesser depths and equipped with better gear, they still face significant challenges ahead. It's easy for cavers to descend hundreds of feet below ground in open-air caves because the air pressure equalizes with the outside through entrances or other cracks. But even going just 60 feet underwater can cause serious changes to the body. At the lowest reaches of 40 Fathom, Scaff and Patterson would be exposed to pressures of roughly 118 pounds per square inch, or around 8 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level. As they swam down, the air in their body compressed under the pressure around them, causing nitrogen to build up in their organs and tissues, a condition known as nitrogen narcosis, which could lead to death. Like all deep dives at the grotto, the divers followed massive guiding lines that marked different depths. As they swam deeper, they had to be more vigilant with each stop, checking for any signs within themselves and their partner, and they would only proceed further down if both agreed they were okay. The effects of deep diving weren't noticeable at first, but as they got deeper, their focus and mental accuracy began to slip away. They prepared for this. They knew it would happen. Some people say nitrogen narcosis is like being drunk or even high on benzodiazepine drugs. It causes mental impairment and tunnel vision. But it wasn't the only problem they had to face. The oxygen in their tanks that they needed to survive could also become poisonous at great depth. Prolonged exposure to a state known as hyperoxia, or oxygen poisoning, can cause damage to the lungs. The retinas in the eyes could detach, which could lead to permanent blindness, and it could even cause seizures, which would mean death at lower depths. Patterson and Scaff were in the right place to test their limits, since Mr. Scuba was one of the top experts at the time, teaching people emergency response techniques for narcosis management. Back then, divers were still experimenting with different blends of gases to see if they could limit or cure nitrogen narcosis. 40 Fathom seemed like the perfect place to test new theories. They had an expert and trained staff waiting on them on the docks above in case anything went wrong. On land, air contains around 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, and a 1% mix of various other gases. Mr. Scuba's training center at the grotto used mostly open air for their dives, which was more susceptible to the effects of nitrogen narcosis. Roughly a decade prior to this dive, cave divers began experimenting with a new blend of gases called trimix, which replaces some of the nitrogen in their air with helium to lower the impact of nitrogen buildup. Trimix has become the standard for most technical diving-related depths, and at depths beyond 328 feet, nitrogen is replaced completely with helium. Now, while these gases make deep diving safer, they can't prevent nitrogen buildup. Since divers were experimenting with other mixtures at the time, it is possible the group used their third tank for a unique mixture. Their experimental method was a necessary step for cave diving, but it would be a fatal mistake. Their battle was not like the cave disasters from open-air adventures. They had no deadly fissures to cross, no dynamic climbs that could slam them against the stone, and almost no worries about rockfall. Instead, their battle would be with their own bodies. If any signs of nitrogen narcosis began to take hold, they had to trust that their training would keep them level-headed enough to overcome a sudden and severe sickness. Even with modern science, researchers still don't fully understand how nitrogen and other gases cause these dangerous effects, which makes every dive a gamble on life. Plus, if they had even a slight cold impacting their sinuses, the depths they chose to descend to could burst their eardrums if they were unable to equalize pressure. Patterson and Scaff made one final check at around 190 feet. They were getting woozy, but that was expected. They could still write and use hand signals, and they weren't losing buoyancy or swimming erratically. Moments later, their nightmare began. Patterson thought they were around nearly 200 feet deep when disaster struck, but later reports indicate that they were around 230 feet deep when he noticed that they had been underwater longer than they had planned. Despite going through all their safety checks, time still slipped away in the fog of pressure and nitrogen that was slowly killing the cells in their bodies. Patterson tried to signal to Scaff. In the dark silence of the cave waters, Patterson had to rely on visual cues to get his diving buddy's attention. Scaff didn't realize his vision had already begun to narrow under the effects of narcosis, and, without acknowledging Patterson, he swam away. Shocked, but still level-headed, Patterson swam faster to catch up with him. As he pushed himself, he breathed harder and faster. His vision tightened on the sight of his friend and fellow instructor. As he coursed forward, he suddenly felt a tug pull him backwards and his movement constricted. He tried to flip around to see what it was, but he couldn't see what was happening. After twisting and turning in the cold depths of the cave, he realized he was wrapped in some rope line. Maybe the rope was already there before, or maybe he lost control of his own reel and it ensnared him near the very bottom of the grotto. Patterson took a moment to center himself and calm down. He began methodically following the line and untangling himself from its grasp. It took some time, and when he was done, Scaff was nowhere to be seen. Patterson realized his time was almost up. His primary air supplies were running out of gas. At this rate, he'd die before he finished the final phase of their planned dive, decompressing. Like shaking a bottle of soda, the compressed air absorbed by Patterson's body would gradually release as he rose to higher elevations. Rising too quickly can be like shaking a bottle of soda. Bubbles can form, causing decompression sickness, DCS, or the bends. Gas bubbles can form in practically any part of the body. If the bends form in the skin, divers usually only experience itching or swelling. But if gas pockets form in the blood, spinal cord, or brain, they could stop breathing, become paralyzed, fall into a seizure, and die. Patterson needed to gradually ascend to allow nitrogen to slowly escape, but he knew he wouldn't have enough time to fully decompress. And to make matters worse, he had no idea where Scaff was. It was getting harder to see, not just because of the narcosis, but because the water of the cave itself was changing. Sometimes the clear water from the spring gets dyed a murky brown, which can hamper sight and make the dive even more dangerous. This rare situation happens when floods carry sediment into the water supply. Normally, divers can see around 50 to 60 feet in the cave. But when this flood of tea-colored water dyes the cave, visibility drops to as little as 3 feet, effectively blinding the cavers. It's unclear what visibility was like back then, but the deepest section of the cave had its own dangers. Starting at around 200 feet, thick layers of muck coated the bottom of the cave where it's the most inconvenient. At those depths, one wrong move could mean your doom. Even in his panic and sick haze, Patterson knew that 40 Fathom Cave wasn't a twisting labyrinth. So if Scaff realized he was alone, he should be able to follow the walls to safety. The mouth of the cave is about an acre wide, and it stretches out much further below the surface. However, it's mostly uniform like a dome. The deepest section veers off to one side with some ledges that could trip people up, but if he followed the incline, he might already be decompressing on his way to the surface. But little did he know, duckweed infestations were slowly growing in the grotto, covering the surface of the rocks and turning the water green with plant matter. At one point in the grotto's history, the algae covered the rock walls, hiding the stone beneath and making it harder to see the gradient of the ceiling above. Since he knew he was screwed either way, Patterson desperately searched for any sign of Scaff. But there were no bubbles, no signs of movement, no sounds, and no guiding line to follow. After spending a few more moments past his own safety threshold, he had no choice but to ascend and pray he wouldn't pass out or run out of air. While Patterson was in danger and actively swimming toward the surface, Scaff was experiencing a horrible fate. Nitrogen narcosis doesn't just lead to a state of drunkenness, it's far more sinister. It can cause memory loss, which can rob divers of their training. They could forget the condition even existed or how to handle themselves. It can also lead to hallucinations, which could be devastating. Scaff could have been swimming in circles. He could have forgotten he was underwater, or he could have already been knocked out by the surge of toxic gases. The final nail in Scaff's coffin was likely their unique air mixture, which could have contained a high percentage of oxygen. Some divers theorized that the effects of deep diving could be countered with higher oxygen content in their tanks, so divers began testing high oxygen blends. But deep pressure causes any air mixture to get denser, making it harder for divers to breathe. This effect is worse with heavier molecules, and oxygen is approximately 12% heavier than nitrogen and 8 times heavier than helium. Scaff's lungs were filled with oxygen that his body turned into CO2, which is even heavier still. These heavy molecules resisted exhalation under the extreme pressure of the underwater cave. With nowhere to go, The carbon dioxide was forced into his bloodstream, poisoning him and worsening the effects of nitrogen narcosis. Scaff's brain sensed the rising carbon dioxide, which triggered his body to breathe heavier and faster as he was suffocating. And this domino effect also leads to panic. Scaff was in a death spiral, one that Hal Watts, or Mr. Scuba, nearly died from in his own training in that same cave back in 1962. Meanwhile, Patterson surged through the water towards the surface, and witnesses immediately knew there was a problem. He instantly started struggling to get his gear off and orient himself. Seeing him struggle, others came to help him to the water's edge. It was clear he was in pain, and they had to help pull him from the water. They all knew he had the bends, and if he had rocketed to the surface alone, that meant Scaff was in trouble. They were asking questions, trying to understand what happened, trying to figure out what they needed to do for him. Staff and other divers called for an ambulance. Patterson's confusion made it hard for him to express what had happened, but the truth was, he didn't know what happened. Scaff disappeared into the dark waters of the cave. Divers began searching the upper levels of the grotto for Scaff, but even by the time the ambulance arrived, they knew it was a recovery mission. Even as an ambulance rushed him away, Patterson was still fighting for his life. The effects of decompression sickness could send him into his own death spiral at any moment. Divers from the sheriff's office and other local rescue groups suited up and plunged into the waters of 40 Fathom Grotto. They searched the rocky crags for any sign of him. Scrapes on the wall, floating reels of rope, gear, a note, anything. They fanned out from the diving lines to systematically cover the most ground, but they also had to worry about the same dangers that the two instructors faced. They resurfaced and tried again after a break, but there was still no sign of him. Every trip had to be carefully planned. It would take the cave divers over an hour to decompress after spending just 10 minutes at the lowest reaches of the cave. The waiting tested the mental strength of the divers as they floated powerlessly in the water, unable to do more for the poor soul trapped in the cave. They searched for almost 7 hours, but there was nothing to be found. Unlike a regular cave rescue, they couldn't simply call for more support. Only a handful of divers were certified to handle the deepest reaches of 40 fathom. This was also in the 90s, when communication and the internet were still light years behind the modern day. It would have been hard or impossible to get more specialists into the area to expand the search. The next day, Watts and a few other pros donned their own gear to aid in the search. After several more hours, they found Vincent Scaff's body. They had been searching near the bottom, but Scaff was stuck under a small ledge around 154 feet down. If he just swam along the wall instead of straight up, he may have survived. His buoyancy devices were fully inflated. Scaff had tried to send himself rocketing to the surface, but the narcosis slowed his movements and dulled his thoughts. His death marked the second drowning at 40 Fathom Grotto in less than 10 years. Working together, they recovered Scaff's body, but he wasn't officially identified until Monday. Patterson was treated at Shands Hospital in Gainesville. He recovered from the bends, and he was released after treatment. 40 Fathom Grotto claimed one more life in 2008, but today, the cave is leased to the Commercial Diving Academy, who added a new mixed gas fill station and renovated the cabins to make the destination more comfortable and appealing to divers all across the world. They dream of restoring the cave to its status as a world-class training facility. Hopefully, these tragic deaths will be the last lives ever claimed by 40 Fathom Grotto. The tiny island of Guam in Micronesia is a popular tourist destination and the home of a United States naval base. But this remote spot hides a dark secret: drownings. Per capita, Guam sees 7 times as many drownings per year as the United States. Even when specifically compared with another island tourist destination, such as Hawaii, Guam's waters are still more than 2.5 times as lethal. Why? In this video, we'll explore Guam's dark recent history and hopefully shed some light on this terrifying phenomena. Guam is a U.S. territory in the northern Pacific Ocean. It is part of the Mariana Islands, which sit near Marianas Trench, the very deepest point in all the world's oceans. Guam's nearest mainland neighbors are Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, and Japan, all of which are well over 1,000 miles away. And even though Guam is the largest of all the Mariana Islands, it's still tiny. The island is only 210 square miles, about the same size as the city of Chicago. In fact, you can drive from the southern tip of Guam to the northern tip in less than an hour. Yet, to get to a nearby major city like Manila or Tokyo, you have to fly in a plane for 4 hours. This makes Guam one of the more isolated locations on the planet, and one of the least ideal places to have an accident, let alone a string of them. Just a handful of years ago, Guam experienced one of its more gruesome 12-month periods on record. In 2017, more than a dozen people died, many of them under surprisingly mystifying circumstances. The long and grisly list of bodies shows just how distinctively deadly these waters can be. February 4th, Henry Santos. The trouble first began on February 4th, 2017. It was just after the start of the dry season on Guam, which is considered the best time for tourists to visit. However, that day, the small island got a shock that visitors and locals alike were not expecting. February 4th was a Saturday. All was going well until 1:53 p.m. that afternoon, when a 911 call came in reporting a distressed fisherman in the waters off the coast of Agat, a village on the island's western shore. It was 58-year-old Henry Santos. By the time rescue personnel arrived, Santos wasn't breathing and he had no pulse. Following an autopsy, Santos's death was ruled an accidental drowning. But authorities wouldn't have much time to ponder what might have gone wrong before they were summoned to the ocean again to extract another body. February 25th, Gaylord Takami. Just 3 weeks later, on the opposite side of the island, witnesses along the shore of Pago Bay reported seeing a fisherman stranded in the water holding a flashlight. It was nighttime around 10:30 p.m. when the calls started coming in. The man was 41-year-old Gaylord Takami. Takami had been out diving for fish with a friend. As the night had closed in, the temperature had dropped. Takami was cold and had decided to head back to shore for the evening. His friend was not far behind, but decided to do a quick final check for fish before heading in after Takami. The pair had reportedly been diving just 400 feet or so from the shore. But upon returning to land, Gaylord Takami was nowhere to be found. The Guam Fire Department eventually found Takami floating at a depth of roughly 15 feet. He was hastily transported to Guam Memorial Hospital, but sadly there was nothing they could do. The local pathologist determined that Gaylord Takami was the victim of an accidental drowning. But despite local officials surely praying this would be the last such accident for a while, their prayers were anything but answered. March 6th. Eric Shane Santiago. The following month, on March 6th, Guam's waters would claim its next victim. This time, it would be a young, healthy, highly skilled spear fisherman, leaving the whole community in shock and bewilderment. Eric Shane Santiago was regarded as a very skilled fisherman, and he had a reputation as a passionate outdoorsman in general. But on the night of March 6th, his family called 911 and told them Eric had failed to return after embarking on a solo fishing trip in Umatak Bay. This happened during Guam History and Chamorro Heritage Day on the island. This made for a dark juxtaposition. While the celebrations wound down, the search party ramped up. Around 9:30 p.m., rescue divers recovered the body of Eric Shane Santiago. 10 minutes later, a crowd was gathered on the shoreline. Residents watched in horror as a gurney carried Santiago's body into an ambulance. Wails and screams were heard, and residents were seen hugging and comforting each other. It was probably at this point that a wider sense of dread started to spread around the island. The ocean had already claimed 3 lives, and it was only 3 months into the year. Stranger still, the waters around the small island had now taken someone who very few would have expected to be a drowning victim, given his skill and physical fitness. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, the year's carnage was just getting started. March 31st, Jeffrey Reyes. Within that same month, Jeffrey Reyes drowned while out catching lobsters with a friend. His friend was successfully rescued, but Reyes's body had to be recovered the following morning. He was found off the coast of Calvo Beach in the village of Talifofo. Reyes was another victim who was familiar with the area and an experienced fisherman. April 12th, Joey Tapazna. Less than 2 weeks later, 18-year-old Joey Tapazna was freediving with friends near Dadi Beach on the island's west coast. Suddenly, a frantic 911 call came into local authorities. Tapazna's friends had suddenly found him unconscious and unresponsive. Tapazna was rushed to Guam Naval Hospital, but it was too late. In addition to Tapazna's drowning, another unexpected death of a young person happened on the same island that same week. 16-year-old Jacob Gombar was found unconscious at Matapang Beach. Gombar was a member of the rowing team at John F. Kennedy High School in northwest Guam. Now, while his death was not a drowning, it's still quite mysterious given the context. Even more mysteriously, Gombar's death was unique in that, at first, the medical examiner wasn't even sure what caused it. It was eventually determined through tissue samples that Gombar suffered massive bleeding of the heart and that he also had pneumonia. But as you can imagine, this determination didn't do much to help friends and family wrap their minds around the fact that a 16-year-old student athlete had so abruptly died. April 29th, Brad Michael Arthur. A couple of weeks later, a 13-year-old named Brad Michael Arthur drowned at Waipao Beach in Tamuning. Initially, the Guam Fire Department thought he was 9 years old, but this was later corrected when his identity was confirmed. July 3rd, Thompson Puaz. 15-year-old Thompson Puaz, a student at Okoto High School, became the next victim in early July. But unusually, Puaz didn't drown in the ocean. His death came in the bowels of a cave. Puaz was exploring Marabo Cave near Mangalao with his older brother and some friends. The group was using ropes to navigate the inside of the cave. But when they arrived at a rocky ledge, they all noticed that Thompson was missing. Thompson Puaz was found by his brother at the bottom of the cave, submerged in the water. Now, I wasn't able to confirm this, but according to a newspaper article published from the island's capital of Hagatna at the time, there's a good chance that Puaz didn't know how to swim, or was a poor swimmer. Now, roughly halfway through the year, Guam, an island already prone to drowning accidents, was on pace to exceed its annual average of deaths. August through September, Shangyon Wu, Myongwon Zhang, Godo Etchin. As the summer wound to a close, 3 more lives were lost to drowning in fairly rapid succession. 90-year-old Shenghyun Wu drowned in the waters of Tumen Bay to the west. 61-year-old Godo Etchan drowned in the waters of Tagja Bay to the east, and a 5-year-old named Myong Won Zhang drowned in a swimming pool located at the Hilton Guam Resort and Spa. October through December, Zhong Li, S.K. Neth, Paul Jose. Before the year's end, an additional 3 lives would be claimed. In early October, in Tumen Bay, just behind the Lot Hotel, 57-year-old Jiong Lee was pulled to shore by nearby beachgoers and pronounced dead due to accidental drowning. In November, another young fisherman drowned. S.K. Neth, 28, was recovered from the waters near Bear Rock in Narahan. Then, on Christmas Day, December 25, 2017, an active-duty airman named Paul Jose was pulled from the waters of Tanguisen Beach and pronounced dead due to accidental drowning. Paul was originally from San Jose, California, and he was stationed at the base in Guam. He was 23 years old at the time, and the last person to drown on the island that year. The above-average number of deaths in the year 2017, and the shocking and sometimes mysterious conditions in which many of them occurred, leaves only one simple question crying out to be answered. Why? What happened to all these people? All 14 of them died in separate incidents, and in many, if not most cases, authorities only arrived in time to collect the body. And although 2017 was an especially bad year, drownings in Guam happen at a high rate every year. So maybe a better question is, what makes drowning so much more likely in general? If we look at this 2017 as a whole, there are some interesting patterns. First, with the exception of 5-year-old Myung Won Jung, who drowned in a swimming pool, all of the victims were male. A significant number of them were also fishermen. Now, beyond that, the waters seem to have been fairly indiscriminate. Drowning victims in 2017 came in virtually all ages, from young children to the very elderly. Drownings happened in afternoons, evenings, and well after sunset. Population density? In exploring possible explanations, I was struck by the observation that, counterintuitively, Guam's small size might actually increase the likeliness of drowning. As mentioned earlier, Guam has a much higher drowning rate per capita than Hawaii, but Guam also has a much higher population density than Hawaii. So even though Guam has way less coastline than Hawaii, it has more people per mile of coastline. It wouldn't make sense if having more people per mile of coastline made the drowning rate higher. If you put more people in the same amount of water, more people will drown. The Jamaica problem. This seemed like a solid theory, until I started looking at other islands around the world. Jamaica, an island with less coastline than Hawaii, but more than twice as many people, is one of the least drowning-afflicted countries on Earth. This island nation has a capital city right along its southern coastline. Fishing and swimming are both popular activities here. Yet Jamaica sees less people drown per year full stop than Guam does, despite having over 17 times the population. If the amount of people versus the amount of coastline was the answer, then we should expect Jamaica's waters to be almost as lethal as Guam's, but they aren't even close. We should also expect places like Greece, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba to be similarly lethal, but they aren't either. The WHO's theory. So if population density isn't the explanation for all the drownings in Guam, then what is? A 2021 report by the World Health Organization stated that a whopping 2/3 of the world's drownings happened in the Asia-Pacific region where Guam is located. The report also stated that in the Western Pacific, lower middle-income countries have drowning rates close to 4 times higher than those of higher-income countries. Guam is part of Micronesia, a lower-income country. The Dominican Republic versus Haiti. Working off of this, I noticed something interesting about the Dominican Republic, its neighbor. As you probably already know, the Dominican Republic shares the island of Hispaniola with its neighbor country, Haiti. Both countries have roughly similar populations. Thanks to Haiti's horseshoe shape, both countries also turn out to have loosely similar amounts of coastline. Yet Haiti's annual drowning rate is almost 5 times higher than the Dominican Republic. Now, looking at a map, it seems clear this discrepancy cannot be the result of natural causes. It seems much more likely that it has something to do with the Dominican Republic being a middle-income country and Haiti being the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. According to the World Bank, Jamaica is an upper middle-income country. Virtually every other country with extremely low drowning rates is also higher income, whether they have coastlines or not. So, perhaps Guam's high drowning rate comes down to resources. Based on the World Health Organization's report, and based on the additional evidence I was able to find, that seems like the most likely explanation. There are all sorts of imaginable reasons why income might affect drowning rates. Safety laws, emergency services, and incentives for fishermen being just a few that come to mind. Still, it's strange and quite heartbreaking to see the reality as it affects individual people and their families. Over a dozen people drowned in horrific fashion on this small island in 2017 alone. And I don't know enough to say for sure what could have been different to prevent these tragedies. All I can say is that I hope this video helps to shed light on the problem and that conditions improve so that fewer people lose their lives. The cave known as Harwood's Hole captivated explorers from the moment they first peered into its shadowy depths. Spelunkers wagered it could be the deepest cave in New Zealand. Scientists and cavers gathered from far and wide to figure out how to enter this strange vertical chasm in the earth. Peter Lambert spearheaded the mission to explore Harwood's Hole, until his ambition became his demise. Join us as we venture into the depths of this cave and uncover one of the earliest tragedies in the history of New Zealand caving. Harwood's Hole Cave is a huge void in the earth below the Abel Tasman National Park on the South Island of New Zealand. The park, named for the first European explorer to discover New Zealand, covers a decent area of 91.5 square miles of lush forest-covered hills, sandy beaches, waterfalls, and rope bridges. The bulk of the park's terrain is comprised of the Takaka Hill Range. These mountainous hills were used to film multiple locations in the Lord of the Rings movies, including the Chetwood Forest near the Shire and Dimrail Dale beyond the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. These hills are made from a prized mineral, crystallized limestone, otherwise known as marble. In the past, quarries blasted apart sections of the rocky terrain to mine the marble and limestone, but now Takaka Hill is part of the park's nature preserve. The vast limestone deposits in the region made the perfect place for caves to form. Instead of long caves slowly winding downward, the caves of Takaka Hill form a patchwork of sinkholes that cut down into the hills. These deep pits feed the Takaka River that snakes through the caves below, and their entrances have been traps for unsuspecting animals for thousands of years. Below these caves, explorers found large deposits of perfectly preserved moa bones and other strange oddities. 30 of New Zealand's deepest caves tunnel down below Takaka Hill, including Harwood's. The Harwood Pit is over 1,000 feet deep with a massive 160-foot opening. Harwood's was first uncovered by a farmer named Henry Harwood, who owned land on the Takaka Hill Range. Once he unearthed the cave, Henry was too frightened to explore it. But a man named Peter Lambert was ready for the challenge. Roughly 10 years before the first Harwood expedition, Peter's relative, Henry Lambert, started the New Zealand Speleological Society, so caving was in Peter's blood. In 1957, Peter Lambert and his fellow cavers from the North Island went across the bay to explore new caves. They met the farmers in the area, and the farmers brought the spelunkers to Harwood's Cave. This sparked a chain of events that was ultimately responsible for creating the caving community in New Zealand. In 1958, a year after cavers first heard of Harwood's, a team of cavers, including Dave Kershaw, Catherine Donald, Malcolm Laird, and Peter Lambert, undertook the first exploration of the cave. It was Christmas Day, but these young adults wanted a world-first experience instead of presents. As they peered down into the cave, they realized the walls weren't perfectly straight. Instead, the cave had multiple outcroppings, almost like the neck of a vase. They couldn't simply rig ropes because technology was lacking back then. The single rope technique, or SRT, had only recently been developed by climbers exploring the Alps. To make SRT work, cavers needed new inventions like assisted braking descending devices such as the Petzl Stop, low stretch Kermantle ropes, new harnesses, and new climbing techniques like the frog sit-stand climb. Ladders were also a no-go. They were dangerous beyond 200 feet, and it was clear that this cave was much deeper. The cavers used their ingenuity to overcome Harwood's strange formations. French caver Pierre Lebon crafted his own winch to deal with similar caves in different areas. Pierre's design worked for a while, and many cavers, including Lambert's team, based their own winches off his design. However, Pierre's winch failed him in the Saint-Nathan cave and he fell to his death. New Zealand caver and engineer Richard Scott created a new winch so his team could explore Harwood's Hole Cave. On the day of the adventure, the team clambered around the entrance of the cave. One of the cavers threw a rock down the mouth of the cave. They waited. It took almost 10 seconds for the stone's dry thud to bounce back up the cave. It was a long way down. Dave Kershaw attached a parachute harness to his back, attached it onto the load hook of the winch, and his friends lowered him down into the cave. The crank slowly turned the winch's drum, and the looped cable unraveled with a rusty creak as Dave inched down into the darkness. The boys above shouted down to the brave caver, but their voices grew thin as the cave went deeper into the unknown. After an eternity of tension, the first caver touched ground in Harwood's cave. This first exploration only went 600 feet down to the first ledge, but it was still a monumental achievement. The next day, Malcolm, Catherine, and Peter Lambert rode the winch down into the darkness. They found a chamber so massive that their primitive headlamps couldn't even reach the walls from one side to the next. As they walked, the floor became a steep ramp descending further down, and it was riddled with pebbles. One slip could dislodge an avalanche of stone and send the cavers sliding to their doom. No matter how much preparation cavers make, a cave-in or rock slide is practically unstoppable. Cavers can only suppress their fears and ignore the ever-present danger. They continued along a horizontal portion of the cave until they reached an underground lake. On this rocky shore, enclosed in cold stone, Lambert and his crew camped for the night. After they got some shut-eye, they climbed back to the first haven and asked the two cavers above ground to send a log down with the winch. They heaved the wood down the steep slope and over to the lake for use as a rudimentary bridge. The room beyond was a gorgeous display of speleoforms, rimstone pools, and a feature known as the Twin Waterfalls. After exploring more passages, they reached a sump, a flooded U-shaped tunnel. Back then, cave diving was also in its infancy, and the team wasn't ready to risk their lives in the unknown depths of the flooded section. With no way to travel further, Lambert's team concluded their first exploration into Harwood's Hole Cave. The next year, Lambert would return to determine if the cave had any connections to other cave systems or if it had other entrances. Word spread like wildfire about the wonders of Harwood, and this time, 21 cavers came to the expedition. On the day of the fated expedition, they once again slowly lowered one another down the pit. To determine new routes or connections, they had to trace the flow of the subterranean river. They used fluorescent dye at the stream near the sump. A second team found the dye in a resurgence above ground, and then they used dynamite to blow open the above-ground creek. This second team of cavers lit the flames of their carbide lanterns and crawled into the darkness. After a long trek, they saw familiar lights ahead. They found the connection they were looking for and emerged near the first campground called the Boudoir. The team named this new region the Starlight Cave, and it proved Harwood was a full system of caves. This second expedition explored nearly 3,000 feet of additional side passages and squirming tunnels in Harwoods. With their mission complete, the cavers signaled to the team at the winch, but they were still excited from their discovery. One by one, they were lifted from the cave. Remember, this winch was initially designed for the first mission to explore Harwoods. There were only 5 cavers for that trip, and they only planned to use it for a few days. But the team kept using it for future expeditions, including this one. The sheer number of cavers in this second expedition put significant strain on the device. The clunky motor that helped crank the winch began puttering with plumes of thick exhaust as it lifted the cavers from the abyss. The winch drum squeaked an ear-piercing sound, causing some of the cavers to wince and duck away from the noise, but when they looked back, the winch was fine. It kept slowly turning and raising the cavers up the hole. They regularly checked the cable for any signs of damage, and after the first caving winch pioneer died, they also kept tabs on the harnesses and the hooks that held the harness and the cable together. They did everything by the book, but they forgot one important detail. As nightfall fell over the camp, the team decided to stay for 2 more days. They put the machine and the bodies to work crawling, climbing, and digging through the stone and mud. After the 2-day extension was finished, the cavers were ready to wrap up their adventure. One by one, the cavers took the slow ride up the pothole. Peter Reed and Peter Diamond were up top ready to help the next caver up the final cliff. They would keep an eye on the ascending cavers to ensure that nothing went wrong. Down below, Les Kermode was up next. Now, no one's exactly sure why, but Peter Lampert approached Kermode just moments before he was about to signal for the team to begin lifting him out. Kermode was hooked up and ready to go, but Lampert asked to switch with him. Kermode respected Lambert's seniority. Without Lambert's team, none of them would be there making history. Kermode stepped back and traded places with Lambert. Lambert attached his harness to the winch, and the machine's squeaky wheels began to turn. Lampert was a few hundred feet off the ground when disaster struck. The winch had been anchored to the rock in multiple points with large bolts and screws. Despite the machine working outside of its intended operating conditions, it performed just fine. However, the vibrations of the winch and its roaring motor channeled through the mounting hardware into the anchors and into the weathered rock. The continuous shaking of the motor and the device caused massive boulders to dislodge from the cliff at the Harwood's Hole entrance. It happened so fast, none of the ledge team could do anything to stop the onslaught. Lampert heard the sounds and looked up, but he was hanging helplessly above the abyss. The boulders tumbled down into the cave and impacted him. The team below ground barely had time to react. They heard the sounds, and they had only a few split seconds to duck out of the way. After the rock slide settled down, they returned to the beam of light streaming down overhead as Lampert's blood dripped onto their helmets from above. The team called to Lampert, but he had no response. His limbs were limp in his harness, and his head hung low as the winch continued its slow, methodical ascent. The team tried to crank the speed of the winch faster, desperately pulling Lampert to the ledge. After what felt like forever, the team got Lampert onto the ledge. He was still unconscious. His injuries were gruesome, but he was alive. The cavers tended to him as best as they could with their outdated medical training and technology. Since caving was just beginning in New Zealand, there was no on-call rescue team to save him. Some of the cavers ran to get help as fast as they could. Help arrived, but not in time. Peter Lampert, the pioneer who ignited the caving community's passion, died from the blunt force trauma of the rock slide. Down near the campsite, the cavers who were still inside the vertical cave piled rocks like the humans of ancient times. They built a cairn in Lampert's honor, which is still there today. Since the winch was unsafe, they took the long trek through the new connection in starlight. The cavers completed the shrine by placing Lambert's helmet on top of the cairn, and they exited the Harwood's Hole cave to rejoin the world above ground. His team was determined to make sure that Lambert didn't die in vain. They returned and proved that Harwood's Hole was the deepest cave in the country, dethroning the previous record holder. Eventually, Ellis Basin in the Nettlebit system was found to be deeper than even Harwood's, but Lampert's trailblazing adventure and his tragic demise united New Zealand cavers. Together, they formed more caving groups and rescue teams to spread their love of the underworld hidden inside caves. Sometimes even tragic tales have inspiring ends. On this channel, we've covered some of the most harrowing tales from some of the most intimidating dive sites around the world. Now, some of you viewers may have wondered, which is the deadliest? Is there one diving location that's more dangerous, more terrifying, more unbelievable than all the rest? The answer is yes. There is one particular dive site with more fatalities to its name than any other. More astonishing than that, no one knows for sure exactly why. Over the years, this mysterious and lethal site has witnessed some very newsworthy accidents, including the deaths of famous divers. But while the international community may be familiar with some of these isolated, high-profile stories, the locals, especially the local rescue teams, are desperate to alert the public about the larger picture. This is the larger picture. This is the incredible history and enduring mystery of Egypt's Blue Hole. To visit the deadliest dive site in the world, you have to travel to a remote region of Egypt on the country's southeastern coast. Even today, there are still only a few major roads that will take you all the way out there, and only one small airport. Along the way, for hundreds of miles, you will see almost nothing but desert. In a country with more than 100 million people living in it, this entire 23,000 square mile region only has about 600,000 of them. If you choose to drive from Cairo, it'll take you about 6.5 hours, but if you do, eventually you'll reach the small coastal town of Dahab. Historically, the first people to arrive here were the Bedouins, Arabic-speaking nomadic people who have long lived in the deserts of the Middle East. With the dramatic Sinai Mountains perched behind them and the calm waters of the Red Sea at their feet, Dahab once served as an idyllic fishing village for generations of Bedouins. However, had these Bedouins been able to fly drones or board helicopters many generations ago, they would have almost immediately noticed something very unusual about their beloved fishing town. It has a hole in it. The jagged, rocky slopes of the Sinai Mountains descend partway below the surface of the Red Sea, but then jut back inward dramatically at one specific point in the coastline. It is at this particular point where, underneath the water, a massive depression sits in the flesh of the earth. Early Bedouins can certainly be forgiven for not knowing the full extent of what was hidden just beneath them. After all, the depression is an example of a strange geological phenomena that nobody fully recognized until at least the latter half of the 20th century. It is, in fact, a submarine sinkhole. It wasn't until recent decades that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration began working alongside recreational divers and fishermen who had been saying for years that they were finding huge underwater sinkholes in various parts of the world. Even today, the NOAA, or NOAA, is still unraveling the mystery of what the Blue Hole and other sinkholes like it actually are, or how they come to exist. Their current theory is that they are similar to sinkholes on land, but they're simply located underwater. The organization admits that much is still to be learned. It is still completely unknown how many of these submarine sinkholes exist, or where they may be located around the world. The full extent of the submarine sinkhole off the coast of Dahab wasn't widely known until the late 1960s. That's because, in June of 1967, war broke out between Israel and the Arab countries of Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. The war was remarkably short, known to historians today as the Six-Day War. But in that short time, Israel managed to capture a swath of territory, including the Sinai Peninsula, and also uncover what many today consider the most beautiful and enchanting dive site on Earth. The Israeli occupation of the Sinai Peninsula would last for another 15 years. In 1982, the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty was officially implemented, and Egypt finally established diplomatic relations with Israel. During the 15-year military occupation, however, the submarine sinkhole off the coast of Dahab was explored by Israeli dive teams. Right away, for the first time, the world finally awakened to the extraordinary diving location that the Blue Hole of Dahab truly is. So what makes it so extraordinary? Well, for starters, unlike many dive sites, the Blue Hole is easily accessible right from the beach. You need only wade out a few meters into the water, and you're there, close enough to remain in earshot of the people still sunning on the shore. Knee-deep in calm water, take just one step forward, and it's a 400-plus foot drop. However, this is not the way divers actually do it. The proper way to enter is from the opposite side. The entrance to the Blue Hole is up the coastline, about 200 meters away. The next thing that makes the Blue Hole so unique is what you find once you enter. What looks initially like an unassuming drop-off into shallow water becomes, after just a few feet of swimming, an open void. It doesn't matter how clean or clear your diving goggles are, you cannot see the bottom. The beginning of the diving route takes you along what is best described as an underwater canyon. Huge rocky walls surround you on either side. Below, the walls descend deeper and deeper, eventually vanishing into the blue nothingness underneath. This wide avenue leads the way forward. The bottom remains so far below as to be completely out of sight the entire time. The height is actually so intense that it's common for divers to get vertigo. Floating in space, hundreds of feet above a perilous drop, the human body and mind have only one natural instinct in this situation. Yet, for those who can withstand the gut-wrenching environment, it can be the thrill of a lifetime. But the most astonishing part of this one-of-a-kind dive site is still to come. Eventually, as intrepid divers swim their way further and further, they see, growing in the distance, something that seems almost too mystical to be real. A bluish glow, as if there is a faint light source sitting at the bottom of the ocean. As you get closer, the bluish glow soon becomes undeniable. It grows larger and brighter until it dominates your field of vision. What this supernatural entity really turns out to be is a massive archway leading into the blue hole itself. From up at the surface, almost like the pupil of some massive eye looking out towards the sun, daylight pours down through the thin layer of seawater and floods down through the chasm of the blue hole. Recreational divers who have swum this far have already been flirting with the limit of what is considered a safe depth. Now, perhaps more than 100 feet below the surface, they must contend with the fact that this glowing archway is still way, way below them. Those who have seen the archway in person all share the belief that there is something almost magically alluring about it. Upon his visit to the site, the excellent diver and TV presenter Monty Halls noted that when you first come upon it, the archway looks easy to pass through, as if the open chamber of the blue hole is inches away on the other side. In reality, the archway is nearly 100 feet across. The blue light is so intense that it shines out across even that long distance, creating the illusion that it is much shorter than it really is. After descending to a depth of over 400 feet and passing through this incredible archway, divers rise through the glowing vertical tunnel and emerge back into daylight at the main opening of the blue hole. The entire dive, from start to finish, carries you a mere 250 meters along the shoreline. Now, while undeniably one of the most uniquely beautiful sights in the world, it is also unusually simple and straightforward. In fact, some in the technical diving community have made the claim that the blue hole should be one of the safest dive sites in the world. But it isn't. The rocky outcroppings near the entrance are littered with signs. Little makeshift tombstones with name after name after name after name. In fact, the total death count is unconfirmed, but ask a local Bedouin diver named Tariq Omar, who has been conducting body recoveries at the Blue Hole for decades, and he'll tell you that well over 100 people have died in the Blue Hole. Some divers familiar with the area even estimate as many as 200. This means the Blue Hole is by far the most lethal diving site on Earth. No cursed Mexican cenote nor dizzying Florida sinkhole even comes close to the rate of death that this wide, straight 250-meter stretch of Egyptian coastline somehow has. In fact, based on records kept by the International Underwater Cave Rescue and Recovery, the entire state of Florida, arguably the mecca of extreme underwater diving sites, has roughly the same yearly death toll as the Blue Hole on its own. Imagine one small stretch of highway out in the middle of nowhere causing as many accidents as every Formula One racetrack combined. Or imagine one small town restaurant where more people get sick than every restaurant in a nearby city combined. Clearly, something out of the ordinary has to be going on. There is something freakish beneath the surface of the Blue Hole of Denab, and it's killing divers of all skill levels at a rate that is beyond abnormal. So, What is it? The people of Dahab have a local legend to explain the sensational killing capacity of the site. The legend states that long ago, there was a young woman who lived on the coast of Dahab named Shaheen. Shaheen had fallen in love with a local boy, but their love was forbidden by their parents. Against her will, Shaheen was engaged to be married to another man, a man who she didn't love. Way back then, the opening to the blue hole was not yet submerged by the sea. In despair, the young Shaheen threw herself over the edge, falling to her death. According to local legend, the blue hole is now haunted by Shaheen's restless spirit. With the enticing glow of the archway hundreds of feet below, the broken-hearted Shaheen lures young men to her, hypnotizing them before taking their souls into the next world. It's a stirring fable, and perhaps one that has more than a hint of truth behind it. But surely there has to be more to it than that. Well, as we're about to see, the history of deaths at this site is nothing short of unbelievable. So, without further ado, let's take a closer look at some of the people who have met their doom in the blue hole. Perhaps their stories can help shed some light on the true nature of this mind-bending phenomena. In November of 1997, 2 experienced divers from Ireland were in Dahab diving with the Paddy Diving School. They were 22-year-old Martin Guerra and 23-year-old Conor O'Regan. According to a report by the Irish Times, O'Regan had previous experience not only diving, but specifically with diving in the Red Sea. His fellow diver Guerra was a diving instructor who had been living in Egypt for the past year. On Wednesday, November 19, 1997, local diver Tarek Omar got the call he had been fearing he would get ever since he started working as an instructor in the area 2 years prior. Martin Guerra and Conor O'Regan had entered the blue hole together and had failed to resurface. Steeling his resolve, Omar dove into the blue hole to look for the missing pair. What he ended up finding would leave a permanent mark on his memory. The 2 Irishmen were resting in a ditch about 335 feet below the surface. Both had drowned, and yet their bodies remained locked in a haunting embrace, almost 2 corpses dancing. Omar later speculated that one had been sinking and the other had been trying to pull them back up when the pair both eventually drowned. But which of the pair had first begun sinking, and why? Their names are among the many that line the rock wall near the entrance, ensuring that even today, their tragic deaths will at the very least be remembered. But understood or explained? Not so much. Nearly a decade earlier, before Tarek Omar had moved to Dahab and earned himself the nickname Bone Collector, another pair of divers had met a similar fate. Daniel Malak and Tarek El-Khadi both drowned in the blue hole on the same day in 1988. Tarek Omar had very little time to dwell on the past, however. Within a couple of years of his first grisly recovery mission, he found himself at the forefront of what would become the blue hole's most famous death. In April of the year 2000, 22-year-old Russian-Israeli diving instructor Yuri Lipsky had been itching to dive the blue hole for at least a year prior. On that fateful day, witnesses say they saw Lipsky entering the water off the coast of Dahab with 2 very important things missing: a diving buddy and an extra oxygen tank. Lipsky's motivations for diving alone and with only 1 oxygen tank remain controversial to this day. But amazingly, one thing we do know he had with him that day was a video camera. The last anybody saw him alive, Lipsky was walking up the coast in his diving gear. When he failed to resurface, word spread quickly. Within a day, Lipsky's father had traveled from Russia to Dahab to look for his son. The man was reportedly all but ready to dive into the hole himself and had to be talked out of it by locals. Once again, the task of searching the blue hole fell to Tarek Omar. The search for Yuri Lipsky was unusual, in that Lipsky had been diving alone, and no one knew how far into the hole he had actually made it. The only way to find out was to conduct a thorough search. Lipsky's body was eventually found at 115 meters below the surface, nearly 3 times the depth considered safe for recreational divers. But Lipsky was no amateur. The 22-year-old was in fact a diving instructor. So why, millions soon wondered, did the video captured by his camera show him descending at a rapid rate towards his own demise? The roughly 7-minute video went on to make Lipsky's death one of the most famous in diving history. It was as disturbing as it was mysterious. Tarek Omar would later offer the theory that Lipsky was weighed down and that his camera may have tipped the scales. However, this explanation alone hasn't been enough to stop the internet from proliferating various theories about the nature of this strange and horrifying accident. Overlooked amid much of the hysteria is the fact that Lipsky's death is part of a larger phenomena, and the phenomena did not stop with Lipsky. A few years after Yuri Lipsky's death received international attention, a 24-year-old diver from England named James Smith went missing at the Blue Hole. The story initially followed what seemed to be emerging as a pattern. He entered the water, and somewhere between there and the opening 250 meters away, he simply vanished. However, one thing that makes Smith's death particularly haunting is that despite the fact he was known to die in a very specific location, namely the Blue Hole, his body has never been found. The rest of us can only assume he's still buried somewhere deep beneath the surface of the Red Sea, swallowed forever by the alluring spirit of Shaheen. Visitors to the Blue Hole today will see James Smith's name alongside many others. But there's another name that might make you do a double take. Karl Marx. It's not the author of the Communist Manifesto. It is, in fact, a 45-year-old German diver who had a fatal accident on January 10, 2007 at the Blue Hole of Dahab. A year after Marx, Swiss diver Stefan Felder suffered a similar fate, descending confidently and peacefully into the calm coastal waters of the Red Sea. Then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, he was nowhere to be found. In recent years, the deaths have not shown any signs of stopping either. In fact, in 2017, international interest was reignited in the remote diving site after a dramatic incident involving multiple pro divers. World record-setting freediver Alicia Zecchini traveled to the Blue Hole in July of 2017. Not only was Zecchini planning to dive at the deadly site, but she would in fact be attempting something that perhaps no person had ever attempted before. She would be trying to cross the Blue Hole's famous archway with just a single breath. Accompanying Zecchini was Irish safety diver Stephen Keenan. Keenan was described by Outsider magazine as, quote, "freediving's most accomplished and beloved safety diver." Surely, if anyone could pass through the deadly Blue Hole and live to tell the tale, it would be the sport's most accomplished and beloved safety diver, right? At about 160 feet below the surface, Alicia Zecchini became disoriented. Automatically, Keenan dove down to meet her. As he swam towards the surface carrying Zecchini, Zecchini was eventually able to regain her bearings and swim to safety. But when she got there, Keenan was nowhere to be found. It was later determined that Keenan had blacked out. It is unknown to this day the depth at which Keenan lost consciousness. He was found floating on the surface nearby, face down, motionless. Keenan's death sent shockwaves through the international diving community, providing even more evidence that the forces at work in Dahab were truly something above and beyond the ordinary in an already extraordinary sport. Alright, we've now looked at just 9 of the potentially 200-plus fatal accidents that have occurred at the Blue Hole. Frankly, most of what we learn from these stories is that whatever forces are at work, they're swift and they're powerful. Divers seem to just disappear in the blink of an eye. Seasoned professionals seem to suddenly lose their grasp of the situation, descending inexplicably, almost as if they're doing it on purpose. As bizarre as the whole thing is, thanks to an international community of diving experts and a growing interest in the site over previous decades, some plausible explanations do exist. We'll go through these one by one, starting with the phenomena known as narcosis. In underwater diving, one of the most important factors for divers to always consider is the inherent risk of breathing out of a gas tank at extreme depth. According to the NIH, quote, "Certain gases at high pressure cause an anesthetic effect that alters a diver's consciousness." This strange condition has also been nicknamed the raptures of the deep. It has even been called the martini effect for the drunken state it seems to put unsuspecting divers in. The mechanics of it are still not completely understood by science, but in short, certain gases with higher lipophilicity cause mental impairment as underwater depth increases. These effects can be felt starting at depths below around 30 feet, and they're usually mild. But once you start descending to extreme depths of several hundred feet or more, the symptoms are downright shocking. Divers breathing at a depth of below 300 feet can experience powerful hallucinations. They can also lose their sense of both time and direction while experiencing dramatic changes in mood, including becoming manic or euphoric. In extreme cases, narcosis itself can even kill you. Divers in the blue hole are potentially encountering depths of 400 feet below the surface, meaning they are way beyond even the far threshold for severe narcosis. The connection here between the science and the mythology is hard to ignore. Upon reaching the glowing blue archway, divers may suddenly be overcome by an eerie change in both body and mind. This change is, by all accounts, something like being really drunk, really confused, and suddenly enthusiastic and impulsive. Could this be the sinister lore of the ancient spirit of Shaheen? As chilling as it is to consider, it is quite possible that many of the divers who met their demise here met it by the propulsion of their own flippers. Just ask Sylvie Martin. An experienced diver in her own right, Martin was diving the blue hole when, according to her own first-hand account, she began feeling off. At about 200 feet below the surface, she actually began intentionally deflating her buoyancy regulator. Her dive buddy had to swim down, grab her, and pull her up toward the surface before she suddenly came to her senses again. If narcosis can induce borderline suicidal behavior in experienced divers, what can it do to inexperienced divers? The simple reality of the blue hole is that it is really, really deep, much deeper than many diving enthusiasts will ever go in their lifetime. Depth does incredibly dangerous things to your mind. But that's not all that depth does. Another deadly obstacle imposed by the blue hole's extreme depth is the sheer challenge of breathing itself. Not only do you run the risk of crazy hallucinations and deranged behavior thanks to narcosis, but you also run the risk of simply running out of air. The reason for this is simple, but easy to overlook or underestimate. The further you descend underwater, and the more water pressure increases, the more oxygen you need. This need increases at an alarmingly fast rate. Atmospheric pressure doubles every 10 meters. So, roughly speaking, every 10 meters you descend, your body requires double the amount of oxygen. When you are hundreds of feet below the surface, the amount of air you need to breathe is many, many times more than what you would normally need on land. Bringing enough air to make it all the way through the depths of the blue hole is a genuine logistical challenge. Even if you bring all the necessary equipment with you, which will surely include several tanks with different gas mixes which you can easily cycle through, you can't hang out down there for long. On the other hand, if you don't bring enough air in the first place, you're obviously in big trouble from the moment you start the dive. To be so catastrophically underprepared would seem like a rookie mistake, but there is ample reason to think that even experienced divers can seriously miscalculate at this particular site. For example, Yuri Lipsky, a diving instructor, reportedly entered the blue hole with only one tank strapped to his back. Even those who are familiar with the fact you need more oxygen for lower depths can still underestimate just how much they need for depths as extreme as this. So in short, we can add unexpectedly running out of air to the list of possible explanations, in addition to losing your mental faculties due to narcosis. But there's still more going on here. It's hard enough already to navigate an underwater dive site with a narcosis-drunken brain and no air in your lungs. But try doing it while also being so deep underwater that you can't even figure out which direction is the surface and which direction is the bottom of the ocean. Now, this sounds almost impossible because it's so far removed from our intuitions about the physical world, but in such a foreign, extreme environment, basic senses we normally rely on start to break down. According to the National Ocean Service, it is rare that sunlight ever reaches further than 200 meters below the surface of the ocean. Divers in the blue hole are potentially swimming well over halfway toward the point where their surroundings would become as black as empty outer space, where photosynthesis is impossible, and where, soon enough, David Attenborough would start pointing out shrimp that glow in the dark and fish with light bulbs dangling in front of their faces. Divers in the blue hole never quite reach this point of total blackness, but keep in mind, they are also wearing masks and heavy diving equipment. And they are swimming through dramatic underwater landscapes that block out what little light there is even further. The ominously intriguing blue glow of the archway is made so, in large part, by the fact that it dominates the spectrum of visible light at that depth. Now, divers will inevitably carry flashlights, but while these are lifesavers when it comes to one's immediate surroundings, they don't provide much help when it comes to the larger picture. Floating through deep, open waters with little to no ability to see the surface means you might decide it's time to bail, and yet realize with shock that you don't know which way to go. This, too, might explain why so many divers who enter the blue hole fail to resurface. There is one last factor worth considering when it comes to the blue hole, or rather, the Red Sea in general. The Red Sea is a unique body of water for two reasons. One, it is home to an unusually vast array of marine life, both fish and plant, many of which can only be found there and nowhere else. And two, it is largely unexplored. Couple this with the fact that many of the blue hole's victims, including even some of the ones we looked at today, have never been found, and it does paint an interesting picture. Of course, let's be clear, this is highly speculative, but it does seem possible, given the amount of unique marine life and how little we still know about what lies beneath the Red Sea, that chance encounters with hostile organisms could perhaps explain some of these disappearances too. After all, where else are unsuspecting divers plunging freely into extreme depths of this particular body of water on a regular basis? The Red Sea has plenty of other popular diving sites, but none so extreme, so deep, so full of shadows. There is something distinctly human about underwater diving. It represents one of our most innate traits in its purest form, the primal impulse to venture into the unknown. It is hard to imagine a world more alien than the world awaiting those who swim the blue hole of Dahab, and yet it sits freely accessible just meters away from the bars and beach towels that line the South Egyptian shore. But this alien world also inflicts strange, rapid infirmities upon our land-dwelling human bodies. It sucks the air from our lungs, even when we thought we brought enough air with us. It confounds our spatial awareness, temporarily erasing physical realities as fundamental as the sky above and the ground below. Perhaps most frightening of all, it corrupts our minds, making us think and do things that only moments ago we would have never imagined. Contrary to what many might believe, however, safely diving the blue hole of Dahab is, in fact, possible. Highly experienced, technically proficient divers can and do take all the necessary precautions and swim through this marvelous natural wonder on a regular basis. But sadly, even to this day, they constitute a mere percentage of the total number of divers who make the voyage out to this mystical and remote site. Until the international diving community wakes up to the truly incredible risks associated with the Blue Hole and begins heeding the warnings and advice of local experts like Tarek Omar, the Blue Hole of Dahab will continue to cast its alluring spell over unsuspecting divers, reeling them in with its magical glow, then snatching them out of existence before anyone has time to save them. The fresh air and warm weather of springtime brought one couple to California's Miramontes Point. They enjoyed plush hotels, vast cliffs, sandy beaches, and the open ocean, until they decided to step inside a coastal cave beneath the bluffs. They lost track of time and suddenly found themselves trapped by raging water. Rescue teams brought helicopters and boats to save them as the tides continued to rise. Find out if they made it out alive as we explore the unique dangers of the Miramontes Point Coastal Cave. The Coastal Cave at Miramontes Point rests at the edge of California's Half Moon Bay. Half Moon Bay was founded as a farming town back in the 1840s, and today it's turned into a small city with a population of roughly 12,000. The town is surrounded by gorgeous parks and the seemingly endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The ocean collides with the rocky coastline, spraying water into the air. The wind across the ocean sweeps up the coastline, dragging the water particles with it to shroud the town in fog. This fog notoriously attracted smugglers to Half Moon Bay, who used it as a major port for exporting liquor during Prohibition. Miramontes Point is sandwiched between the Ritz-Carlton and a beach. The Ritz-Carlton is a luxury hotel and resort that provides wealthy patrons with a plush 5-star experience. The resort's golf course stretches across the bluffs, which limits visitors from the view on that side of Miramontes Point, but at least the flat grass doesn't further obstruct the view. This hotel is a popular destination for couples who want to celebrate their weddings or anniversaries in comfort, surrounded by the unique landscape that only California's coast can provide. The other side of Miramontes Point leads down to the Three Rocks Beach, which attracts hikers, cavers, and travelers, including one couple in May of 2020 who got so caught up in the beauty of the area that they nearly lost their lives. This couple visited Half Moon Bay to bask in the warm sun while the ocean waves serenaded them as they celebrated their love for one another. The pair walked down to the beach and saw the 60-foot bluffs of Miramontes Point extending overhead like the awning of a cathedral. Along the beach, they found gnarled driftwood and small shells that painted little splotches of color along the smooth sand. Summers in California can be swelteringly hot, which would have ruined their vacation. Many travelers consider going out west for the winter to beat the cold back home, but even without heavy snowfall and ice, the winter weather has a strange effect on beachgoers and fans of coastal caves. Changes in the Earth's rotation and the weather creates higher than normal tides, which cuts the 1.5-mile beach trail in half. On low tide, the soft, sandy beach extends for hundreds of feet as shelves of foamy waves gently roll forward, causing mist to rise up into the hills and trees of the coast. After an early dinner, they walked along the Three Rocks Beach as the gentle tides covered their tracks behind them. Down the way, they saw a hole in the bluffs and went to check it out. As they approached, the beach narrowed into a thin strip. They realized they were looking at a coastal cave, and curiosity got the best of them. They carefully tried to walk along the tightrope coastline to avoid water splashing them, but the sandy ground was now so narrow they couldn't avoid splashes from incoming waves. Unsettled by the water but undeterred, they kept walking and entered the cave. Coastal caves have many unique features for spelunkers, and they're usually safer for regular folk who wouldn't normally dare to venture into an underground labyrinth. Coastal caves can contain unique ocean life like starfish, barnacles, and sometimes even rare deep-sea monsters can find themselves stranded on the shores outside of California's coastal caves. This cave is one of many that continue to dot the shores for miles south of the city. That night, they could have continued walking to wider sections of the beach, or gone back to enjoy glasses of wine and comfortable robes. But instead, they felt sheltered by the strong arched stone overhead. Even though the beach is vast and the view is endless, there's almost always people in view. Inside the cave, they could relax as if they were back home. The pair sat side by side, admiring the beauty of the sunset over the ocean. The sounds of endless city traffic were far, far away, but the relaxing ocean became a shouting chorus as they lost track of time. Before they knew it, the water was at their feet, and even the low tide didn't leave the mouth of the cave. They were trapped inside the Miramontes Point cave. The couple was confused. They saw the high tide earlier. There shouldn't be another high tide until tomorrow, and this time the water level was far higher than they saw earlier. No storms were overhead either. Their confusion and disbelief added to their fear as they clung to each other and prayed to be rescued. Little did they know, multiple factors influenced the tide, but their mistake could easily happen to almost anyone. Coastlines that only have one high and low tide each day follow the diurnal tide pattern, and semi-diurnal tides have 2 cycles per day. It's no surprise the vacationers were used to diurnal and semi-diurnal tides because almost every shore on the planet follows these predictable patterns. For example, almost all of Europe, Africa, and over half of the eastern coast of the Americas all follow this pattern. Semi-diurnal tides are very consistent both in their frequency and the overall water levels they produce. But unlike the eastern U.S., the California coast can have multiple high and low tides per day in what's known as a mixed tide. Squeezing more cycles into a 24-hour window shortens the length of each low and high tide, which could lull beachgoers or coastal cave explorers into a false sense of security. Visitors to mixed tide beaches cannot rely on the water level from earlier in the day to predict future high tides, since each mixed tide can bring much more water than the last. One of them tried to remain calm, suggesting that someone would notice their absence and rescuers would see their footprints. That trail would be a clear indicator they were stranded inside the cave, since a pair of prints went into the cave, but there was no trail leading out of the cave and no trail heading the opposite way. But the other partner grimly pointed and looked out in horror. The thin beach was completely submerged, covering their tracks and leaving no trace of where they had gone. They weren't wrong about their first observation. One of the employees at the nearby hotel noticed their absence. They never arrived at their dinner reservation. The employee informed additional staff until the message made it to a lifeguard who looked down the beach. The sunlight was only a small sliver over the ocean, which made it hard to see anything against the foggy cliffs. With his hand cupped to his ear, he heard a faint sound cutting through the waves. Screams of terror. The guard called 911, and Half Moon Bay's emergency crews raced to the bluffs. The beach was almost completely gone all along the coastline. They had to park by a road near the top of one of the ledges. Firefighters were the first to arrive. They were joined by the Coastside Fire Protection District at 9:15 p.m. The rescue teams called down to the couple to assess their condition. The pair was frightened by the rising water, pushing them closer to the ceiling and closer to drowning in a whirlpool of water slamming into the rock. They weren't confident in their abilities, but they wanted to get out now. They asked if they could swim to safety, but they were advised to stay inside the cave. The vicious tide was strongest at nightfall, and the undercurrent could pull them below the waters, drowning them or sending them bobbing into the open ocean with no hope of being found in time. To make matters worse, the cave's stone walls sapped the heat from the area, leaving the air chilly as the water got colder and colder. The pair was physically fine for now, but if crews didn't act fast, the water could get too cold for them to hang on to any rescue attempts. Night fell over the quaint bay area as many of the town's inhabitants were unaware of the danger unfolding at Miramontes Point. The darkness shrouding the beach complicated the mission. Caves are always pitch black no matter what time of day rescuers venture inside, but they're confined spaces where handheld lights can cover the job. Headlamps wouldn't cut it here. The raging tides could easily splash and block or distort the light, and anyone attempting to rescue them would be in constant motion. During the extraction, rescuers would have to face the other direction to swim away or climb, leaving the stranded couple in the dark. The rescuers would need to look back to check on the couple, leaving themselves exposed to dangers in front of them. And if anything happened to the trapped would-be cavers, the rescuers wouldn't see it in time to react. The firefighters and the growing rescue party on the cliff called for backup from ocean units, and the Pillar Point Harbor Master sent their own rescue vehicle to the scene. The California Highway Patrol lent their helicopter to aid the rescue mission as well. The air and water vehicles shined their massive 1,600-watt searchlights onto the cliffs. With the searchlight beams that could travel up to a mile away, rescuers could finally see the situation to plan the rescue. Although the waters were high enough to drown the cave-trapped couple, they were too shallow for the Coast Guard to approach the shore for a rescue by sea. Helicopters can be used for cave rescues, especially on mountains, but this one wasn't equipped to handle these extraction missions. Rescuers would need a special safety system, secured ropes, and multiple harnesses to perform a helicopter rescue, so they needed to come up with a new plan. Rescuers also had to spitball ideas on how to tackle the problem of the cold water. Normally, cave rescuers would use a harness or a stretcher to safely lift victims up and out of caves. That way, people don't have to expend any more energy. Usually, by the time cave rescuers reach the target, the subjects are too tired or hurt to move. Plus, most rescues happen to inexperienced cavers. These are spelunkers who couldn't handle the physical challenges of the caves on their own, and it would be irresponsible and dangerous to expect them to pull their own weight after they already needed help. As long as they make it out alive, they can always train and try again later. But this cave presented new challenges to the rescuers. The coastal community lacked the equipment needed for traditional cave rescues. Without the proper equipment, they would have to rely on Coast Guard rescue methods, which place more responsibility on the people being rescued. They had to act fast, because the strange semi-diurnal tide wasn't the only factor influencing the water levels. The tide continued to rise as rescuers debated their course of action because of the rising moon. The moon heavily impacts sea level and the cycle of tides. Tides will be at their peak during the sublunar point when the moon passes directly over that side of the planet, while the lowest tides occur perpendicular to the high tides. So, the closer the moon is to the surface, the higher the tides will be. And the high tides on one side create a wave around the planet so that the opposite side of Earth also has high tide. These sublunar points can change depending on the moon's cycle. The moon is closest to the Earth at a point called its perigee, and this creates what's known as a supermoon, which is much larger in the sky. Since the moon is closest to the planet at its perigee, the tides will be at their highest cyclic point during this event. The pair were trapped in the cave on Thursday, May 8, 2020, the night of the supermoon. By the time the first emergency crews made it to the scene, the water was already 2 feet higher than it was at the previous high tide. Rescue teams decided they would need to rely on a single swimmer to rescue both of the trapped explorers. They simply couldn't wait for additional experts to arrive. One slip from the inside of the cave could lead to death, and the supermoon-fueled tide was still rising. The swimmer was a trained rescuer, but even the strongest and most talented rescuers can be swept away by the tide or crushed by the undercurrent. To provide this brave hero with support, the fire crew attached a rope system on the top of the bluff and let it down the side of the cliff. The rope would be too unstable for the cavers to climb, but the swimmer could attach to it for his, her, or their own safety. By 9:45 p.m., only 30 minutes after the first crews scrambled to Miramontes Point, the water level had risen almost 5 feet above the low tide earlier in the day. In spite of all the challenges, the rescue moved lightning fast, and crews were ready to begin the extraction. The swimmer cut through the water, unfazed by water splashing through their nostrils and the salt stinging their eyes. They reached the inside of the cave and paused to catch their breath. The water inside the cave was even more dangerous than the tide smashing against the bluffs. The water swirled around, making it almost impossible to swim in a straight line. But this swimmer was molded by the waves. One at a time, the rescuer summoned all the strength of a tugboat and pulled them through the surging waters. The couple was shaken, but unharmed, thanks to the fast-thinking and brave efforts of the Half Moon Bay rescue team. This story is a reminder for anyone exploring the beaches or delving into oceanic caves. Always check the weather and prepare with emergency first aid just in case. Tide charts are also usually available to alert travelers of the dangers behind the beautiful facade of the world's beaches. Park rangers also patrol the shores, and they can give helpful tips as well. So remember that over-preparing beats being caught off guard, and even the most pristine nature spots can quickly turn deadly, especially when they involve cave. Have you ever noticed how supermoons affect the ocean?